The letter arrived at Hillside Transitional House on a Tuesday in November, slipped between a power company flyer and a newsletter from the county's Workforce Development Office that Nora had stopped reading months ago. She was standing at the mailbox in the parking lot when she pulled it from the stack, and the weight of it made her slow down. The envelope was cream-colored, inexpensive in the way that certain paper is expensive, the kind that has texture you notice under your fingertips. The return address said Whitaker and Crane, attorneys at law, Billings, Montana. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She opened it there in the parking lot because she had learned, in 16 years of navigating systems that processed her like a shipment, that delaying bad news did nothing useful. The cold came off the asphalt in dry gusts that smelled like diesel in early winter. The letter began, "Dear Ms. Callahan, we are writing on behalf of the estate of Elias James Callahan, deceased, of Callahan Flats, Montana. You have been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate." Nora read that sentence 3 times. She had no family. She had been told she had no family in the way that institutions tell children things. In passing, between other pieces of information, with the mild efficiency of someone clearing items off a checklist. Her mother, Kathleen Callahan, had surrendered parental rights when Nora was 5 years old. The file said no next of kin. That phrase had followed her through 11 placements and 4 counties like a persistent administrative footnote. Elias James Callahan had apparently never read her file. Inside the house, her roommate Della watched her read it the second time at the kitchen table. Della was 31 and had aged out of the system herself 8 years earlier, and she recognized the specific expression on Nora's face. The look of someone who has just received information that doesn't fit anywhere in their existing understanding of the world. "It says I inherited land," Nora said. Della was quiet for a moment. "How much land?" 280 acres in a place called Callahan Flats. A farmhouse, a barn, various outbuildings. She set the letter down. "I didn't know I had a grandfather." "You didn't?" "No one mentioned him." "Not once." Della made coffee. Nora read the letter a 3rd time. The attorney's name was Martin Whitaker, and his office number appeared at the bottom with a note that he was available to discuss the terms of the estate at her earliest convenience. He'd included a photocopied deed with her name printed across the grantee line and the address of a county recorder's office where the transfer had already been filed. Elias Callahan had died on September 14th, 11 weeks earlier, from a stroke. He was 77 years old. He had lived on the land in Callahan Flats for his entire adult life. She called Martin Whitaker the next morning from the pay phone at the diner where she worked breakfast shifts. He answered with the kind of unhurried manner that attorneys use when they are old enough to have stopped performing urgency. "Miss Callahan, thank you for calling. I'm very glad you received the letter. I was worried it might not reach you." "Why?" He paused briefly. "Your grandfather spent a number of years trying to locate you. The state's records were, as I understand it, difficult to navigate." She stood in the diner's back hallway with the smell of eggs and coffee grease around her and tried to absorb what he was saying. "He was looking for me. For approximately 14 years, yes. He hired 2 different search firms at various points. The foster system's privacy protections created significant barriers. By the time we finally obtained your current address through a recently retired caseworker who remembered your file, your grandfather's health had already declined to the point where travel wasn't possible." She couldn't think of anything to say to that, so she said nothing. "He left detailed instructions for this eventuality," Martin Whitaker continued. "He wanted to be very clear about his wishes. The property goes to you, all of it, with no conditions attached. There are some other documents at the farmhouse that he specifically asked be left for you to find yourself. He was particular about that. Why? I believe he wanted to explain things in his own words. He was a private man. He felt a letter in an attorney's office wasn't the right context." Nora spent 2 days making arrangements. Her manager at the diner let her take a week unpaid. Her month-to-month lease on her room at Hillside extended through December, so she had somewhere to return to. She owned a 2007 pickup truck that she'd bought from a mechanic 3 years ago for $800 and had been maintaining with the obsessive attention of someone who cannot afford to have it fail. She loaded it with 2 changes of clothes, her sleeping bag, a case of canned food, a toolbox, and a road atlas, though the phone's GPS would cover most of the route. Callahan Flats was in the northwestern corner of Teton County, 212 miles from Bozeman. The drive took her through basin land that emptied out gradually as she went north, towns thinning to grain elevators and gas stations, and then to nothing at all except fence lines and the brown stubble of harvested fields running to the horizon. The mountains appeared in the northwest, white-peaked and close enough to look like a painted backdrop. The sky in November had that particular quality of high country November, pale and scoured clean, the sun riding low enough that it threw long shadows by mid-afternoon. She turned off the state highway onto a county road, and then off that onto a gravel track marked by a mailbox that had been there long enough to rust at its base and list slightly north. The name on the mailbox, painted in faded block letters, said Callahan. Her own name, on a mailbox, in a place she'd never been. The track ran through a gate that stood open, its latch rusted in the open position, and curved through a stand of cottonwood trees whose bare branches made complicated geometries against the sky. She could see the farmhouse ahead, a two-story structure with a metal roof and a porch that ran the full width of the front. The paint was gone from the lower boards, weathered down to bare gray wood, but the upper stories still showed traces of white. The windows were intact. The chimney stood straight. She sat in the truck for a while after she parked, looking at it. The county assessor's map that Martin Whitaker had sent showed the property's boundaries. The farmhouse occupied the north end of the parcel. Behind it ran a barn and two smaller outbuildings, one of them a workshop with double doors. The southern portion of the land included a seasonal creek and, at the property's lowest point, a pond of roughly half an acre. She got out into cold that was significantly sharper here than in Bozeman. The wind came from the northwest and carried real intent. The cottonwood leaves that hadn't fallen yet scraped against each other with a papery sound. The farmhouse was unlocked. She found out later that Elias Callahan had not locked his door in the last 20 years of his life because he said there was nothing in the house worth stealing and he was too old to go looking for his keys. The interior was dim and cold and smelled like old wood smoke and something beneath that, something she couldn't name until later, when Della told her that old houses where people have lived alone for a long time develop a particular smell that has to do with the specific habits of one person accumulating over decades. It wasn't an unpleasant smell. It was layered. It had history in it. She went through the rooms slowly. The kitchen had a wood stove and an electric range, the latter old enough to have metal coil burners instead of the glass surface type. The cabinets held canned goods and dry staples, enough for months, organized with the systematic logic of someone who had always lived far from a grocery store. The living room had a reading chair positioned near the window with the best light, and beside it a small table that held a lamp and a glass for water. On the walls were 3 photographs and a calendar from 2 years ago that hadn't been turned since March. She studied the photographs. The first was a landscape, the view from the barn's upper door looking south toward the pond, taken in summer when the grass was high and the pond was full and the mountains were visible on the clear southern horizon. The second was a man who had to be Elias, 60s maybe, in the photo, with a lean face and light eyes and the kind of hands she noticed first on people, large-knuckled from work, holding a fence post like he was posing with it because it was the thing he happened to be holding when someone told him to stand still. The third photograph stopped her. It was a school picture, the kind taken against a blue background in September, and it showed a girl with dark hair and light eyes, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a shirt with a collar. Nora recognized the shirt. She had it still, folded in a box under her bed in Bozeman. It had been her first day of 2nd grade at Millers Creek Elementary School, and the teacher had told them all to look happy, and she had done her best. Elias Callahan had a school photograph of Nora from 2nd grade on his living room wall. She sat down in his reading chair. The cushion was compressed from years of one person's weight in that particular position. Outside, the wind went through the cottonwood branches. 14 years of looking, Martin Whitaker had said. She thought about the school photograph and what it would have taken to obtain it, the caseworkers, the privacy regulations, the requests probably denied, and the search firms probably spending months on bureaucratic dead ends. She thought about a man in his 60s sitting in this chair looking at a photograph of a granddaughter who didn't know he existed. She got up after a while and went upstairs. The bedroom she found there was neat in the spare way of people who have fewer possessions than space. The bed was made with a wool blanket, military tight. On the nightstand sat a small journal with a worn cover and a pen beside it. She didn't open it yet. She looked at the bookshelf that occupied the wall opposite the window. The books were organized by subject: agricultural and farming texts, histories of the Montana Territory, several volumes on geology and mineralogy, 3 or 4 on metallurgy. And on the bottom shelf, incongruous beside a thick farmer's almanac, 2 books about the foster care system in the United States, their spines soft from reading. She picked up one of the foster care books. Inside the front cover, in careful pencil handwriting, were notes in the margin of the table of contents. Chapter 7, Rights of Biological Family. Chapter 12, Barriers to Contact and How to Navigate Them. Chapter 19, The Adult Adoptee Search Process. He'd been trying to understand the system that was keeping him from her. She put the book back exactly where it had been and went downstairs. She needed to see the rest of the property before the light went. The barn was 30 years newer than the farmhouse, built when it needed to be and maintained in the manner of something still being used. Inside, 2 stalls that hadn't held horses in years, a workbench along the east wall with tools hanging in their outlines, a loft above with the remains of last summer's hay stacked in bales that had started to sag from settling. At the back, a door led to the workshop. The workshop was different from the barn. Its floor was concrete, poured levelly and without the cracks that come from settling. The walls were insulated, she noticed, with a layer of rigid foam beneath the interior boards, unusual for an agricultural building. Along one wall, shelves held materials she couldn't immediately identify: containers of desiccant, rolls of archival-grade plastic sheeting, a hand pump for removing air from sealed bags. A chest freezer stood against the opposite wall, but when she opened it, it held nothing. At the back of the workshop, half hidden behind a heavy canvas drop cloth, she found a workbench holding equipment she recognized from a materials science class she'd audited at the community college the previous spring. A small scale calibrated to grams, a set of testing acids and labeled glass vials, and a loop of the kind jewelers use. Testing equipment. For metals, she thought. For purity. She replaced the canvas drop cloth and went out the back of the workshop into the cold. The light was starting to fail, that particular contraction of late afternoon in November when the sky goes from pale to the color of old pewter. She had maybe 40 minutes before dark. She went south toward the pond. The land tilted down gently from the barn, through a section of scrub willow that would be impassable in summer, but was open now that the leaves were gone. Their thin branches making a latticework she could see through for 50 yards in every direction. The grass was brown and flattened from the first frosts. Her boots pressed it down, and it didn't spring back. The pond appeared through the willows as a pale oval, larger than she'd expected from the assessor's map. Its surface was partially frozen. The shallower edges and the north end where the inlet came in had a skin of ice 2 or 3 inches thick, opaque and white near the center where it was thinner, clear as glass at the edges where it was thickest. The deeper southern half was still open water, dark and still, reflecting the pewter sky. She walked the perimeter. The frozen edge was maybe 10 or 12 feet wide at the north end, and she tested it carefully with 1 foot and found it solid before she committed her weight. It held. She moved along the bank, looking at nothing in particular, looking at everything, the way she'd learned to examine new places from years of arriving in them without warning. At the western edge of the pond, where the ice met the bank at a slight overhang of frozen mud, she stopped. Something was in the ice. It was a few inches below the surface, suspended in the clear outer margin of the frozen zone, and it caught what remained of the afternoon light in a way that the surrounding ice and mud didn't. Small and dark, a concentrated shape in all that transparency. She crouched down and cleared frost from the surface of the ice with her palm, cupped her hands against the glare, and looked through. A key. An iron key, old enough to be pitted with rust, larger than a house key and heavier looking. It lay flat in the ice as if it had settled there rather than been placed, and from it hung the remnants of something organic. What had been twine once, or leather cord, reduced by water and time to a fibrous residue that still held its basic structure. And attached to that remnant, barely legible, a metal tag. Rectangular, thin, the size of a postage stamp. She could make out letters on the tag through the ice, but couldn't read them at this angle. She went back to the barn for a screwdriver and a chisel. The ice came up in pieces. She worked carefully, not wanting to drive the key deeper, prying up sections of the frozen surface and lifting them away. It took 20 minutes of careful work, and by the time she reached the key her fingers were numb and the last of the light was almost gone. She lifted it out of the remaining slush with both hands, transferred it to her jacket pocket, and walked fast back to the farmhouse. Inside, she held the key under the kitchen light and read the tag. The tag was stamped metal, the kind that could be ordered from a hardware catalog, and the letters had been pressed in with a hand tool, each letter struck separately, which meant some of them were slightly uneven, the metal slightly different depths. But they were legible. Nora. Just that. Her name, for letters, in stamped metal on a tag attached to a rusted key found frozen in the ice of a pond on land she'd inherited from a grandfather she'd never met. She set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. She lit the wood stove with kindling from the pile beside it and a box of matches she found in the kitchen drawer. And when it had caught, she added 2 logs and adjusted the damper and sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on and her hands wrapped around a cup of water she'd heated on the electric range. The key lay on the table between her and the wall. He had put it there. Elias Callahan had put a key in the ice of his pond with her name on it. Or near the ice, and the ice had taken it. Either way, it had been waiting. She thought about the workshop's contents again. The scale, the testing acids, the archival materials. The books about the foster system on the bottom shelf. The school photograph on the wall. What had he been building, all those years, on this land, while he was trying to find her? She ate from a can that night and slept in her sleeping bag on Elias's bed because the wool blanket smelled like wood smoke, and she wanted the warmth of the stove rising through the floor. She had put the key on the nightstand beside his journal. She hadn't opened the journal yet. She wasn't ready for his voice yet. In the morning, she walked the full perimeter of the property. It took 2 hours, following the fence line, and what she found was that the land was in better condition than the building suggested. The fences were maintained, recent staples in the wire, posts replaced where old ones had rotted, the corners built properly with bracing. Whoever had been doing the fencing had taken their time. She found evidence of field drainage work in the lower sections, plastic tile, exposed where the soil had eroded at one end, the kind of improvement that cost money and paid back slowly over years. The southeast corner of the property had a stand of ponderosa pine 30 feet tall, planted close enough to be a windbreak and old enough to have been put in decades ago. The land had been taken care of, deliberately, systematically, with an eye toward the long term. On her way back from the south fence, she cut across the lower pasture and passed the pond again. The morning light showed the hole she'd made in the ice the previous evening, a dark opening surrounded by the white of intact ice, and in its center the small void where the key had been. She thought about why he had put it there, if he had put it in the water or near the water or simply left it somewhere nearby and let time and ice do the rest. Any of those possibilities said something, though not the same thing. Putting it in the water meant he was certain she'd find it there, that he'd left instructions somewhere, a letter, a note, something directing her attention to the pond. Not putting it in the water, but leaving it close enough for ice to take it meant something else, something less calculated, something that had to do with the pond as a place he came to, a place where he thought about her. She didn't have enough information yet. She went to the workshop. This time she moved through it more systematically, opening drawers, examining the contents of the shelves, reading the labels on the containers. The desiccant was industrial grade. The archival plastic sheeting was the kind used in document preservation. She found a notebook on the lower shelf behind the testing acids, its cover marked with dates that spanned 12 years. She sat on an overturned bucket and read it. It was a record book, methodical, spare, almost without narrative, page after page of dates and entries in a handwriting that was slightly different from the journal upstairs, less personal, more careful. Each entry noted a type of material, its condition at time of acquisition, the price paid, the weight, the assay result, the storage location. Some entries included a code that repeated across multiple pages, a letter and number combination she didn't understand at first. The letter was always B, followed by a number between 1 and 30. Bay numbers, she thought. He'd organized whatever he was storing. The materials listed were consistent. Gold bullion, the earliest entries read. Then, later, placer gold, meaning dust and nuggets recovered from alluvial deposits rather than refined. Then certified bars, with names of assay companies. Then coins, specific denominations, dates of mintage, grades, weights. And between those, At irregular intervals, other things. Property certificates, stock documents, bearer bonds, a financial instrument she'd read about in an economics course, whose value transferred with physical possession. The weights accumulated across the pages in a column she added up in her head as she went. She lost track of the precise number by the midpoint of the notebook, but the rough figure she'd reached by then was already staggering. She set the notebook down and looked at the concrete floor and thought carefully. The entries stopped 14 months before Elias's death. The last one, dated August 2 years ago, noted an addition and a total figure. She went back to that page. The total he'd written was not in dollars. It was in troy ounces, the standard unit for gold, and beside it in parentheses he'd written a date and a spot price, the current market price at that date, and done the arithmetic. She stared at the number for a while. Then she went outside and stood in the cold morning air for a bit longer than necessary. The number was not proof of anything by itself. The notebook was a record of what Elias had acquired and stored, not an inventory of what he'd kept. Things could have been sold, spent, lost. The storage locations he'd referenced as bay numbers might be empty, or might never have existed as physical spaces. But the testing equipment in the workshop was not the equipment of a man who had sold his collection. You kept to say equipment for checking new acquisitions, not for sentimentality about a practice you'd abandoned. And the archival materials were not decades old. Some of the desiccant containers had manufacture dates within the last 5 years. He had been maintaining something. Recently, actively, up until his health failed. She went back inside and climbed the stairs and sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the journal. She had told herself she wasn't ready for his voice yet, but she understood now that she didn't have the luxury of that particular hesitation. Whatever the key unlocked, she needed to find it before someone else did, and to find it she needed to understand what Elias had known and planned. The journal's first entry was dated 12 years ago. The handwriting was the same lean script she'd seen in the record book, but freed into something more personal. Sentences that ran longer, the occasional crossed-out word, the marks of a man writing for himself rather than for record. October 3rd, she read. The search firm says they've hit another wall with the state's confidentiality rules. 11 years now. I think about this girl every day, and I cannot get past the paperwork. Martha at the assessor's office says I should try a different approach, and I'm running out of ideas about what that means. The land is in good order. The collection is sound. If I go before she's found, all of it will sit here waiting for her. Martin Whitaker has the instructions. I have to trust in the mechanism I've built. She kept reading. The entries were irregular, sometimes daily, sometimes weeks apart. They were not, mostly, about the collection. They were about the land, fence repairs, weather, the condition of the creek in wet years and dry ones, the behavior of the mule deer that used the south pasture, a pair of sandhill cranes that visited the pond in there. Migrations. He wrote about books he was reading. He wrote about the mountains and what they looked like in different seasons from the window of his reading chair. But Nora appeared throughout, reliably, not in every entry, but often enough that she understood she had been a constant presence in his thinking, a person he was writing toward, as if the journal were a form of conversation with her that he couldn't conduct any other way. June 15th, she read from an entry 2 years earlier. Found a photograph in the newspaper's archive, Bozeman Daily Chronicle, a team photograph from a high school swimming competition. Third lane, back row. Dark hair, light eyes, her mother's cheekbones, but something in the set of her expression that reminds me of my own mother, my grandmother Grace. I don't know if it's her. The timing is right, and the name beside the photograph matches. I cut it out, and I'm keeping it. And I feel like a man who's been sitting in a dark room for a long time, and someone has lit a match. She found that entry on the second-to-last page before a section of the journal was taken up by what appeared to be instructions. Not to himself, but to her. The handwriting changed there, became more deliberate. Each letter formed completely, the way people write when they are thinking about being read rather than about thinking. She read the whole section before she moved. Nora, he had written, if you're reading this, then Martin found you and I didn't. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorrier than I know how to say. I want you to understand some things before you find what I've left. Your mother was 17 when you were born. She was in trouble I didn't know how to fix, and the kind of trouble she was in doesn't respond well to fathers trying to fix it anyway. She loved you. I want you to know that with certainty, because I knew her before things got away from her, and I know the person she was underneath all of it. She loved you, and she knew she couldn't keep you safe, and she made the choice she thought would give you the best chance. It was the wrong choice, probably. She knew that too later. I spoke to her once, about 5 years after, and she knew. I tried to get you back. I fought the state for 2 years and I lost. I was old and alone on a farm in a county with one courthouse, and they said it wasn't appropriate for a man in my circumstances to take on a child. That's a rough summarizing of a long and ugly process. I'm not putting the worst of it in here because it wouldn't serve any purpose. What I did instead was build something. I had a small stake when all that legal fighting was done, money I'd saved from 40 years of ranching, and I put it into gold. I'd always trusted gold more than paper, more than banks, certainly more than institutions that told me I wasn't fit to raise my own granddaughter. Gold doesn't change its opinion of you. It has weight, and it holds weight, and if you preserve it right, it outlasts everything else. She stopped reading there and looked at the ceiling. Then she kept going. I've been adding to it for 22 years, he wrote. Some years more than others. Some years I sold cattle or equipment or timber rights to get the cash to convert. I wasn't doing anything dramatic. I was just converting what I had into something that would last, something I could leave to you that no bank could freeze and no institution could redirect. There's a key. I left it at the pond because the pond is the place I've always gone to think about you. I wanted the thing that would open what I built for you to come from the place I thought about you most. I know that might seem strange. I am a practical man in most respects, but I am not a man without sentiment, and I am allowed a little sentiment about this. She closed the journal. She sat with it in her lap and listened to the house around her and felt, for the first time in a long time, something she couldn't immediately name. It took a few minutes. It was the feeling of being known. Not well, not completely, not in the way of someone who had actually been there for the daily accumulation of her life, but known from a distance, thought of, held in someone's mind with care and specificity. The school photograph on the wall downstairs. The newspaper clipping of a swimming competition she may or may not have been in. 12 years of journal entries written toward her, like letters sent to an address he wasn't sure was correct. She went down to the kitchen and picked up the key from the counter where she'd set it after breakfast and held it in her palm. The rust came off on her skin, orange-brown and fine. The iron beneath was still solid. He was right. It would outlast both of them. She was putting on her jacket to go to the workshop when she heard the vehicle. It came up the track fast, the way vehicles do when the driver has driven this road before and knows its surface, the crunch of gravel consistent and confident. She watched from the kitchen window. A pickup truck, newer than hers by at least a decade, dark green. It stopped in the yard near her truck and sat idling for a moment before the engine cut. The man who got out was perhaps 50, heavy-set in the way that suggested he had once been fit and was still strong, with the kind of face that had been pleasant in youth and hadn't traveled well into middle age. He wore a rancher's coat and good boots and looked at the farmhouse the way people look at properties they're evaluating, methodically, without sentiment. She opened the front door before he could knock. He looked her over with the practiced casualness of someone who assesses people for a living and doesn't particularly try to hide it. Miss Callahan. That's right. Gordon Pryce. He extended his hand, and she shook it briefly. I've been managing some of the surrounding properties for the last decade. I heard about Elias. I'm sorry for your loss, though I understand you two weren't acquainted. We weren't, she said. He nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already known. I wanted to come by and introduce myself. I've been involved in a few land transactions in this county over the years, and I have some familiarity with the Callahan parcel. He looked past her into the farmhouse with an expression that had too much familiarity in it for a man who was introducing himself. Have you given any thought to what you'll do with it? I've been here one day. Of course. He smiled in the way of someone used to controlling the timing of conversations. I don't want to pressure you. I just want you to know that there's genuine interest in this parcel from parties who would make a fair offer. The land has good water rights, and the timber on the southeast corner has value. More to the point, the geological surveys from this section of the county have been encouraging on the mineral rights side. She kept her expression neutral. Encouraging how? Pryce made a vague gesture that managed to convey both specificity and evasion. There's been interest in what's below this ground for a number of years. Elias was always reluctant to discuss it. He was a man who kept things close. She waited. In any case, he said, when you're ready to have a conversation, I hope you'll consider all your options. He took a business card from his breast pocket and held it out. The card was the kind with embossing and his name in a font that was slightly larger than necessary. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. He had 2 phone numbers on it and a company name, Pryce Land Management and Development, Billings, Montana. She took the card. What were Elias's mineral rights used for? They weren't, as far as I know. He wasn't a development-minded man. But what's in the ground doesn't disappear because the person above it isn't interested in it. She looked at the card. I'll be in touch if I need anything. He read her tone correctly and didn't push. He was the kind of man who picked his moments. He walked back to his truck and she watched him back out of the yard with the same easy confidence he'd arrived with. Someone who had driven this track before and expected to drive it again. She closed the door and stood in the kitchen with his card in her hand. Geological surveys. Interest in what's below the ground. The mineral rights to 280 acres, sitting dormant while Elias had built something below his own workshop. She thought about the timing of his visit. She'd arrived yesterday. She hadn't called anyone except Martin Whitaker, and Whitaker had no reason to tell Pryce she was here, which meant Pryce had been watching the property, had either known she was coming or checked regularly for signs of occupation. She put his card in her jacket pocket next to the key and went to the workshop. The braided rug was blue and brown. It covered most of the workshop's central floor, and she rolled it back from the south end, working methodically, moving a wooden sawhorse to get to the far edge. The concrete beneath was clean, swept at some recent point, and in the middle section she found what Elias had described in the journal, a rectangular outline in the concrete, the seams filled with a dark compound that had been applied carefully enough to be nearly invisible until you were looking for it. On the south edge, a ring, recessed flush, painted the same gray as the concrete so that it required looking from an angle to distinguish. She fitted her fingers under the ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than she expected, reinforced on the underside with steel plate, and the hinges were heavy-duty and well-oiled. It swung up smoothly and stayed in a braced open position from a chain set at 45 degrees. Below was darkness and a smell that was cool and mineral and dry, a stone smell, the smell of enclosed earth kept at a consistent temperature. Wooden steps descended into the dark. She could see them for the first 6 or 8 feet, and then nothing below that. She found a heavy-duty flashlight on the workshop shelf. She checked its batteries and clicked it on and went down. The steps were solid beneath her feet, made from treated lumber, 15 of them, descending at a shallow angle to give them each enough rise to be comfortable. At the bottom, her feet found a floor that was stone, not concrete, smooth from some kind of finishing, and the flashlight's beam began to illuminate what was around her. The space was perhaps 25 feet across and low-ceilinged, maybe 6.5 feet at the peak, which was formed by the underside of the workshop floor above, reinforced with heavy beams. The walls were stone as well, mortared fieldstone, the same kind she'd seen in the farmhouse's foundation. Along those walls, at regular intervals, wooden frames had been built into the structure, and within those frames sat the bays she'd seen referenced in the notebook. B1 through B30, each marked with a hand-lettered number screwed into the wood above it. The flashlight played across the nearest bay. She saw the stacked shape first, the rectangular regularity of it that was too precise to be natural. Then the color, the matte golden color of refined metal, neither bright nor reflective in the diffuse flashlight beam, but unmistakably itself. Brick-sized shapes, stacked in rows 6 across and 4 deep, wrapped in the archival plastic sheeting she'd seen in the workshop above, each wrap sealed with the tape she'd also seen on the shelves. She counted the bays visible from where she stood. They all appeared full. She went to the nearest one and picked up the top bar through the plastic. It was heavier than it looked. Much heavier. Her arm dropped with the weight of it, and she steadied herself against the wooden frame. The weight of gold was something she knew abstractly, from an economics class, from reading, but knowing it intellectually was different from feeling it. The density of it was almost shocking, the way something that small could be that heavy. She put it back carefully and straightened, and stood in Elias Callahan's underground room, breathing. The stone smell air, with the key in her pocket and a flashlight in her hand and 30 bays of what she was now certain was not a small collection spread around her in careful archival order. She needed to call Martin Whitaker. She needed to understand what Gordon Pryce knew. And she needed to sit for a moment in the place that her grandfather had built for her without him, because none of the other thoughts were large enough to contain what she was looking at. But holding them all at once kept her steady enough to climb back up the steps into the cold light of the Montana afternoon. Outside, the mountains to the north caught the last horizontal rays of the afternoon sun, and the snow on their peaks went briefly pink. The cottonwoods along the track rattled their last leaves in the northwest wind. The pond at the south end of the property lay still, its frozen edges reflecting the sky, the dark hole she had made in the ice already beginning to crust over again at its margins. She stood outside the workshop with the flashlight in her hand and felt the cold settle around her and understood that everything she'd been told about herself, by files and caseworkers and institutional forms that said no next of kin, was incomplete. Not wrong. Exactly. Because Elias hadn't been able to reach her, but incomplete in the way that all documents are incomplete, reducing living things to the categories available on the form. She had a grandfather. He was dead, and she'd never met him, and he had spent 22 years converting cattle and timber and equipment and whatever else he'd had into gold, and storing it under his workshop, and waiting to find her, and she had not even known he existed. Inside the farmhouse, she lit the wood stove again and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the key in the ring of lamplight. The key was old iron, and it had a name stamped on its tag, and that name was hers. She turned it over in her fingers and felt the roughness of the rust and the solidity of the metal beneath, unchanged from whatever it had been the day Elias had put it near that pond, which was the day he had decided to stop waiting and to make the waiting useful instead. She needed allies. She did not know yet what she was facing from Gordon Pryce or what he knew. But his question about the mineral rights had the quality of a question asked by someone who already suspected an answer, and a man who had been watching this property was a man who had an interest in what would happen to it. Whatever was underground was hers. Elias had made it hers. Martin Whitaker had documented it as hers. But there was a difference between being right and being protected. She needed to know what the collection was worth in terms she could defend. She needed to know what Gordon Pryce actually wanted and how far he was prepared to go to get it. She needed to read the rest of Elias's journal, all of it, to understand what he had built and why, and what he had thought about the specific dangers of it. She picked up the key again and held it. One end of the key was a simple bow, the ring for holding it. The other was the blade, with 2 rectangular cuts in the iron that corresponded to pins inside whatever lock it was made for. It was a heavy key, the kind made for a door rather than a cabinet, built to last. He had chosen well. The fire in the wood stove settled and shifted, and the farmhouse ticked around her as the temperature outside continued to drop and the structure adjusted to its own contraction. She had learned to sleep in strange places, and she would sleep here tonight, and tomorrow she would understand more of what she had found. The mountains were invisible now in the dark, but she knew they were there. She thought of the photograph on the wall downstairs, the blue background, the collared shirt. 2nd grade. 22 years ago. More or less, while Elias Callahan was just beginning to understand that the legal road to his granddaughter was going to take longer than he'd imagined. She thought of him finding that photograph somehow, going to some trouble to get it, and she thought of him looking at it in this lamplight in this same chair and thinking, that's her. She was here now. She put the key in her jacket pocket and sat with the warmth of the stove until the room reached a temperature she could sleep in, and she watched the fire through the stove's glass door and did not try to make sense of everything at once, because some things have to be lived into rather than thought through. She was up before dawn, which was habit from years of opening shifts at the diner, and she made coffee on the electric range with grounds she found in the cabinet, and stood at the kitchen window watching the sky over the mountains change from black to the dark blue that comes before the sun clears the peaks. She called Martin Whitaker at 8 o'clock. He answered promptly, and she told him what she'd found. She described the workshop, the trapdoor, the bays along the walls, the notebook with its record of acquisitions. She did not tell him the number she'd approximated from adding the entries. She was careful about that because she was still uncertain whether she was ready to say it aloud. Martin Whitaker was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "I suspected there was something significant." Elias was careful with details in a way that suggested purpose. He was not a man who made plans without a reason for the specificity. "Did you know what it was?" "Not the particulars, no. He told me only that there were assets at the property that were legally his and that would become yours upon his death, and that the documentation was in order. He asked me to verify the transfer of deed and to locate you, and to ensure that the property was transferred cleanly with no competing claims." "Are there competing claims?" "Not that I'm aware of. The property has been in Elias's name free of mortgage or lien for 30 years. The mineral rights are attached to the surface estate. He never partitioned them." She thought about Pryce. "A man named Gordon Pryce came to see me yesterday. Pryce Land Management and Development. He said there's been interest in the mineral rights." Martin Whitaker's tone changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough. "How did he know you were there?" "I don't know. He presented himself as a neighbor who manages surrounding properties." "He's not a neighbor. He's been making inquiries about the Callahan parcel for at least 6 years." Elias refused to take his calls. He once sent a letter offering to purchase the mineral rights separately from the surface estate, which is not a standard transaction, and Elias did not respond. She held the phone and looked at the mountains. "What does a non-standard transaction mean?" "It means he wanted what's below the ground without having to take the land above it. That's unusual. It suggests he either knew or suspected there was something worth having underground." She set her coffee cup down. "What can he do?" "He can file a competing claim if he believes he has basis for one, but I don't see how he establishes that basis. The title is clean. Your grandfather's documentation is complete. Pryce is an interested party with no legal standing that I can identify. That doesn't mean he won't try something. It means that if he does, we'll have a strong foundation to defend from." "I need an appraisal," she said. "I need to know what's actually there." He gave her the name of a specialist in Helena, a woman named Janet Ash who worked in estate valuation with a subspecialty in precious metals and historical commodities. He said she was honest and thorough and had worked on several unusual estates in the region. He said he would call ahead. After she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand and thought about what Martin Whitaker had not said. He had not expressed surprise. He had not asked her how much she thought was there. He had moved efficiently to the question of defense and documentation, which meant he had been thinking about those questions for some time. Elias had been careful with him, too. She went to the workshop and spent the morning doing what she should have done the previous evening, a systematic inventory. Not of the collection itself, not yet, but of the space. She counted the bays. There were 30, as the notebook had said, numbered consecutively and each built to the same specification. She measured the bays by stepping them off. Each was approximately 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, built as a frame into the stone wall, with a wooden floor raised 3 inches from the main floor on cleats to allow air circulation and prevent moisture. 21 of the 30 bays held material. 9 were empty. The empty ones were at the higher numbers, B22 through B30, and in each of those she found a note in Elias's handwriting, on a small card tucked beneath a rock, that read reserved. Reserved for what? He hadn't written. She stood in the middle of the space and turned slowly, the flashlight finding each bay in sequence. The collection covered 21 bays. Some held the stacked bullion bars she'd seen in the first one. Others held flat wooden boxes that she opened carefully to find coins, organized in archival sleeves, labeled in the same careful hand she'd come to recognize. Other boxes held paper instruments, certificates, bonds, documents that crinkled at the edges. At the far end, one bay was given over entirely to a metal cabinet with a combination lock, its door bearing a note that said, "Journal, page 42." She went upstairs and found page 42 of the journal. The combination is the year my father came to this valley, he'd written. He arrived in 1931 and he never left, and neither did I, and I hope you'll have some choice in the matter. 1931, left, right, left. She went back down and tried the combination. The cabinet opened. Inside were two items. The first was a folder of documents she didn't examine yet, closing it back when she saw it was thick with paper and would require time. The second was a leather case, small and rectangular, the kind used for presentation of certificates or awards. She opened it. Inside, on a backing of dark velvet, sat 9 gold coins. Large, heavy, clearly old, their surfaces worn but still showing the detail of their original minting. She picked one up and turned it toward the flashlight. An American Eagle, the pre-1933 type, the kind that had been recalled from circulation during the Depression and were now numismatic artifacts. The date on the coin she was holding read 1907. Below the coins, a folded note. These were my father's. He brought them from back east when he came. They're the beginning of everything, and they stay together. She put the coin back and closed the case and latched the cabinet and stood in Elias Callahan's underground room in the pale beam of the flashlight, listening to the silence that was the silence of a space designed to hold things indefinitely. She counted what she knew. 21 bays of material. The notebook she'd found in the workshop, which had been a running record of acquisition. Whatever was in the locked folder. And the collection of coins that had started it, her great-great-grandfather's savings, brought from the East in 1931, the seed of everything Elias had grown from them across 40 years of patient addition. She climbed out, secured the trapdoor, replaced the rug. A truck came up the track in mid-afternoon, this one older than Pryce's, a work truck with mud on the wheel wells and a cattle gate in the bed. The woman who got out was perhaps 65, lean and direct in her movements, with gray hair cut short enough to be practical and an expression that assessed the situation quickly and didn't waste time performing anything. She stopped when she saw Nora on the porch and said, "You must be Nora." She said it not as a question, but as a conclusion reached from evidence. "I am," Nora said. "Iris Delaney. My land is to the east, the 500 acres behind the creek. I've been keeping an eye on this place since Elias went to the hospital in September. Someone had to check the fences." She came up the porch steps, and Nora held the door, and she went inside with the ease of someone who had been in this kitchen before. She looked at the wood stove and the stacked firewood, and then at Nora. "You know how to run that stove?" "I figured it out." "Good. Elias's supply is stacked in the woodshed, and it'll last you through March if you're not wasteful." She paused. "He talked about you." "When?" "For the last 10 years at least. He mentioned you in most of our conversations eventually. Always as a fact, not as a complaint. He'd say, 'My granddaughter's in Bozeman,' or 'The girl's working in a diner now. I read it in something or other.' He followed what he could find, which wasn't much." Nora sat down at the kitchen table, and Iris Delaney sat across from her with the ease of a woman who had spent her adult life in other people's kitchens and knew how to be at home in one. "He found pieces of information about me," Nora said. "What he could get. He was not a man who gave up on something because it was difficult. He was the most patient man I've known, and I've known some patient people. He could spend 6 months on a fence project that most ranchers would do in a weekend, because he was doing it a particular way for reasons only he fully understood, and when he was done it was done right, and it would hold." Iris looked at her directly. "He left you everything." "He did. You found the workshop." It wasn't a question either. Nora looked at her, and after a moment said, "You knew." "He told me something was there. Not the particulars, he was private about the particulars. But he said, 'If anything happens to me before I find Nora, tell her to look at the workshop. Don't let anyone else in there.' I asked him once what he'd built, and he said, 'Everything I could.' That was all he said, and I didn't ask again because it wasn't my business." Nora thought about what to say, and then said, "Gordon Pryce came yesterday." Iris's expression tightened by a small amount, enough to notice. "He moves fast. You know him. He's been after this land for years. Not the farmhouse, not the pasture, specifically the land south of the creek where the geological formation runs under it. He had a survey done 6 years ago, and Elias caught the crew trespassing and ran them off and called the sheriff. Nothing came of the trespass because Pryce had enough lawyer to make the paperwork difficult. But Elias knew after that what Pryce was after." "What is he after?" Iris looked at her steadily. What do you know about the geological formation in this part of the county? Not much. This valley has a gold-bearing quartz formation that runs under several properties. The formation is deep and extraction would be expensive, but in the last decade the extraction technology has changed enough that it's become viable. There are active mines 10 miles north of here. Pryce has been assembling mineral rights in this valley for 5 years, buying them from landowners who don't know the value or who need the cash. She paused. He's missing one piece. This property. This property. The formation runs under the south section of Elias's land, and without those mineral rights the extraction on the other properties he's accumulated is significantly less efficient. He's been patient about it because Elias was stubborn and wasn't going anywhere. Now Elias is gone and Pryce thinks the next owner will be easier. Nora sat with that for a moment. Is the formation worth a lot? Millions. Tens of millions, depending on extraction costs and gold prices. Pryce stands to make considerably more than he'd pay for the rights, and he knows it. She looked at the key on the kitchen table. Elias never sold. Elias understood what he had, and he had his own reasons for keeping it intact, which I think you're starting to understand. She did. Elias had been building something under the ground, accumulating physical gold in a room below his workshop, while above him the same geological formation that drove Gordon Pryce's interest ran through the stone of his property. He had known what was under his land and had chosen to leave it there, to leave it as a foundation, to build on top of it rather than extract it. What Pryce wanted to do to the land, Elias had done to himself. He'd converted the possibility of underground value into actual, portable, preserved wealth. But he'd done it with his own hands, over decades, adding bar by bar to the bays he'd built below. Iris stood. I'll come by again tomorrow. If Pryce shows up again, you have my number. She wrote it on the back of a seed catalog envelope she found on the counter. And there's a man in town, Callahan Flats. The town, not this property, though your family named it. A man named Roderick Hale who handled Elias's legal matters locally. He's not as sophisticated as your Billings attorney, but he knows this county, and he knows Pryce's history here. Worth talking to. She put her coat on and went out. Nora sat at the table after the sound of Iris's truck had faded back down the track, and she read through more of the journal. The light outside went from afternoon to evening without drama, the sky simply darkening by degrees, and she fed the stove twice and didn't bother with the overhead light until she had to, reading by the last of the natural illumination and then by the lamp. The journal's later sections were addressed to her in longer passages. In some places she found herself having to slow down because the handwriting had changed, become less regular, the hand of an older man, and she had to follow the letters more carefully. There's something I need you to know about the pond, he had written in an entry from 3 years ago. I go there most evenings in summer. I take a camp chair and I sit at the north bank where the inlet comes in and the water is clearest, and I watch the light change on the surface. I've done this for 20 years, since your mother gave up her rights, and I understood you were gone from my reach. The pond doesn't care about any of that. It just does what water does, which is to hold the light it's given and to keep moving even when it looks still. I left the key on the post at the north bank because that's where I went to think about you. I wanted the thing that would open what I built for you to come from the place I thought about you most. I know that might seem strange. I am a practical man in most respects, but I am not a man without sentiment, and I am allowed a little sentiment about this. She closed the journal and set it down. Outside, the Montana dark was complete, the kind of dark that only exists in rural places, deep and multidirectional. Through the kitchen window, she could see the stars over the mountains. The key was on the table in front of her, and she picked it up and turned it over once, feeling the roughness and the weight of it. An old key, pulled from the ice of a pond, named for her. What she would do next began assembling in her mind in pieces. She had to understand the full scope of what was in those bays. Gordon Pryce knew something he hadn't told her, and she needed to know what he knew before he knew what she had found. And she was 21 years old, and she had no experience with any of this. The last fact was the honest one, and she sat with it rather than looking away from it. She was 21 years old, and she had grown up in a system that had processed her without cruelty, mostly, but without any preparation for the situation she was now in. She had learned to work hard, to manage with very little, to read people's motives quickly, to be self-sufficient in the way of people who have no reliable alternative. Those were not small things. But she had never had to defend something valuable. She had never had to navigate the danger of being a person who has something that someone more powerful wants. She understood the danger existed. She understood it better than people who had grown up protected from it, because she had grown up without that protection and had watched from a close vantage point the ways in which people with resources moved against people without them. Elias had understood it too. He had built the room below not just as storage, but as preparation, understanding that whoever received it would need the contents to be undeniable and portable and beyond the reach of the kind of institutional maneuvering that had taken her from him in the first place. She needed people around her who knew things she didn't. She had Martin Whitaker. She would call Janet Ash in the morning. Iris Delaney had offered herself as a resource, and the offer had the weight of sincerity rather than interest. And there was Roderick Hale in the town of Callahan Flats, who knew Gordon Pryce's history in this county. She also thought about the 9 empty bays marked reserved, and the folder in the locked cabinet that she hadn't examined yet, and the sense that Elias had been organized in a way that was specific rather than general, that he had planned for more than simply leaving the collection to her, that the reserved bays might mean something, and the folder almost certainly did. There was more to find. She was sure of that. She put the key in her jacket pocket, which was where it would stay for now, close to her and not forgotten. She fed the stove for the night and went upstairs and lay down on the bed and listened to the house around her, the sounds of an old structure that had held one person's life for decades and was now beginning to hold hers, however tentatively, however uncertainly, however new. Tomorrow she would call Janet Ash. Tomorrow she would go into the town and find Roderick Hale. Tomorrow she would open the folder in the locked cabinet and read whatever Elias had put there for her to read. Tonight she lay in the dark and breathed the cold, slightly smoky air and felt, underneath the uncertainty and the practical anxiety about Gordon Pryce and the weight of decisions she didn't yet know how to make, something that was not happiness exactly, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of being in a place that had been waiting for her. She had been in 11 placements in 16 years, and she had not belonged to any of them. She had belonged to herself, which was the only reliable option available to her, and she had managed that with more competence than the system expected and more loneliness than she had ever told anyone. Elias Callahan had gone to a pond every evening for 20 years and thought about her. He had built rooms below his ground and filled them with something lasting and named a key for her and left it near the water. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood branches, and the pond at the south end of the property lay still and dark and cold. And somewhere underneath the workshop floor, in the stone-smelling silence of 30 bays built for a purpose, the thing Elias had spent his life making waited for whatever she would do next. Janet Ash drove up from Helena in a white Subaru that had seen serious mileage and wore it without apology. She arrived at 9:30 on Friday morning, which was 2 days after Nora had called Martin Whitaker, and she got out of the car carrying a canvas bag and a hard-sided case of the kind used to transport instruments. And she stood in the yard and looked at the farmhouse and the barn with the practiced attention of someone who read properties the way other people read faces. Nora watched her from the porch. She was perhaps 55, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like a second set of eyes that were waiting to be useful. She wore practical clothing, boots with real soles, and she moved with the efficiency of someone whose time was worth something and who understood this without needing to perform it. Miss Callahan. She came up the porch steps and extended a hand. Janet Ash. Martin speaks well of you. He's known me for 4 days. She smiled briefly. He spoke well of your grandfather, and by extension. He said Elias Callahan was the most deliberate man he'd encountered in 30 years of estate law, which I take to mean he left nothing to chance. He didn't, Nora said. She brought Janet inside and made coffee and sat across from her at the kitchen table while Janet opened her canvas bag and took out a notebook and 2 devices, one a small digital scale, the other a handheld instrument with a probe that Nora didn't recognize. XRF analyzer, Janet said, following her gaze. X-ray fluorescence. It reads elemental composition without damaging the material. For gold, it gives purity to within a fraction of a percent. She set it on the table. Before we go to the collection, I want to ask you some questions about what you've observed. Not about the quantities, but about the organization, the condition, the storage methods. Nora told her. The bays, the archival plastic, the desiccant, the notebook with its 12 years of entries. the maintenance dates on the desiccant containers, the concrete floor, and the insulation in the workshop walls above. The way the bay numbers corresponded exactly to the entries in the record book, each one mapped to its contents with the precision of a man who trusted systems more than memory. Janet made notes. She was a good listener, which meant she didn't interrupt and didn't perform engagement. Just received the information and wrote what mattered and left the rest alone. When Nora finished, Janet looked up from her notebook. The archival materials are significant. A lot of people who accumulate physical gold store it improperly. Humidity and temperature variation degrade the plastic that bullion bars are sometimes wrapped in, and condensation causes oxidation on the surface of coins that affects their numismatic value. If he maintained consistent conditions, the collection will be in better shape than most I see in estate work. He replaced the desiccant regularly, Nora said. The most recent containers were dated 14 months ago, right up until his health declined. That's consistent. She closed her notebook. Let's go see it. They went to the workshop and Nora rolled back the rug and lifted the trapdoor, and Janet descended the stairs with the handheld flashlight she'd taken from her bag without being asked. Nora followed with the heavy-duty light from the workshop shelf. Janet moved through the space without speaking for the first several minutes. She walked the perimeter, looking at the bays from a distance before she approached them, which was the same thing Nora had done on her second visit, the instinct to read the whole room before touching any part of it. She bent to examine the mortar between the field stones. She pressed her palm to the wall and held it there. Dry, she said, and the temperature is consistent with what I'd expect for a properly insulated below-grade structure in this climate. Maybe 55, 56 degrees Fahrenheit. She straightened. He did this right. She began with the first bay, working methodically from left to right as the numbers ran. She opened archival plastic carefully, using a tool from her hard case that allowed her to reseal the wrap afterward without losing the integrity of the seal. She placed each item on the portable scale and recorded the weight. She pressed the XRF probe to the surface of each bullion bar for the count of 3 it required and read the display and wrote the number. Nora watched from a position slightly behind and to the side, where she was out of the way but could see the display of the XRF when Janet turned it toward the light. The numbers were consistent. The bullion bars ran between 99.5 and 99.9% pure, which Janet told her, without looking up from her notes, was standard for investment-grade gold. The coins required more time, because Janet examined each one individually under her loupe and assigned a grade based on condition and checked the date and mint mark against a reference she kept in her head and occasionally verified in the catalog app on her phone. The 1907 Eagles, she said, when she reached the locked cabinet. She had asked for the combination, which Nora had given her. She held one of the 9 coins in her gloved hand and turned it toward the light. St. Gaudens design. These are pre-1933. She paused. Do you know the history? Something about the Depression. In 1933, Roosevelt ordered the recall of gold coins from circulation as part of the government's effort to stabilize the currency. Most were melted. The ones that survived outside the banking system, whether held privately or abroad, became collector items. Pre-33 American gold coins in good condition are worth considerably more than their gold content alone. She looked at the coin through her loupe. This one is MS-63. Mint state. She set it back on the velvet with the care of someone returning a borrowed thing. She spent 4 hours in the room. Nora went up twice to add wood to the stove and once to bring down 2 cups of coffee, and Janet accepted the coffee with a brief nod and didn't slow her work. When she came up the stairs the final time, she stood in the workshop for a moment and removed her gloves and put them in her bag with the instruments. Then she looked at Nora. Do you want the figure now, or would you rather sit down first? Nora looked at her steadily. Now, Janet told her. The sound the farmhouse made in the silence that followed was the sound of a cold building settling in the mid-morning cold, a small tick from somewhere in the wall. Nora was aware of it in the specific way you become aware of small sounds when large information has just arrived and your mind is casting around for something of manageable scale to hold. That's at current spot price, Janet said. Gold fluctuates. The numismatic value of the coins is separate from the bullion value and more stable. The instruments and bearer bonds are a different category and will require a financial attorney to assess, but based on my experience with similar instruments, they add meaningfully to the total. The The 9 reserved bays are genuinely empty. She paused. He didn't get to fill them. Nora stood at the workshop window and looked at the barn. He built 30 bays, she said. He only needed 21. He was optimistic. Or he was building for a future that included you as a participant, not just a recipient. She set her bag on the workbench. I need to ask you something. Do you know a man named Gordon Pryce? He came here 2 days ago. Janet's expression didn't change, but something in it became more deliberate. He contacted my office last year asking for a referral to an estate appraiser who specialized in rural Montana properties. I declined to make a referral because the way he described the inquiry raised questions I didn't like. She looked at Nora directly. He was asking, in so many words, whether there were appraisers who would value a collection below its market value in order to reduce estate tax liability, which is a thing that does happen, and it's fraud, and I don't refer people to appraisers who do it. He thought someone would inherit a collection, and he wanted to know how to undervalue it. He was planning ahead. She pulled on her coat. The mineral rights under this property are a separate question from the collection, but both have value, and a man who's been watching this parcel for years has probably made calculations about both. The question is whether he's patient or whether he's decided that time is now working against him. How would time work against him? Because you're here. As long as the land sat with no occupant and no heir in sight, he could afford to wait. Now there's someone on the property who is presumably going to start making decisions, and the window for certain kinds of maneuvering narrows. She picked up her bag. I'll have a written appraisal to you and Martin Whitaker within the week. The documentation will be thorough enough to be useful in any legal proceeding. She looked once more at the trapdoor, still open, the darkness below it like a held breath. Your grandfather was a careful man, Miss Callahan. The collection is documented well enough to stand up to scrutiny. That was deliberate. She knew it was. After Janet left, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the key and the journal and a cup of tea that went cold while she thought. The number Janet had said was not a number she'd had access to any frame of reference for. It was not a number that connected to anything in her experience in a useful way. She had spent 4 years calculating whether she could afford a tank of gas, whether a cut in her diner hours would make December impossible. The number did not fit in the same mind that had done those calculations, and she understood that it would take time before it did, that the practical meaning of it would arrive in pieces rather than all at once. What arrived first, and more immediately useful, was the certainty that Gordon Pryce knew. Not the full figure, probably, but enough. He had a geological survey of the mineral rights. He had been watching the property. He had asked Janet Ash last year about undervaluing an estate, which meant he had expected the collection to exist before she found it. Someone had told him, or he had deduced it from the evidence of Elias's habits, the supply runs to Helena, the acquisition patterns that a careful observer might have noted over years. She needed to know what he knew and how he knew it, and she needed to know it before she did anything else. She called Iris Delaney. Roderick Hale's office was in a building on the main street of the town of Callahan Flats that had been built in 1954 and not significantly altered since, a single-story structure of blonde brick with a plate glass window that still had his name in gold leaf on it, slightly bubbled at one corner where the adhesive had lifted. The office smelled like paper and old upholstery and a faint trace of pipe tobacco that had been absent from the room for probably 15 years, but had soaked itself into the walls thoroughly enough to outlast the habit. He was 70, lean, with the kind of face that had the right lines in it, not from vanity, but from use. He'd been practicing in this county for 41 years, and he shook Nora's hand like someone who had made decisions about her before she walked through the door and had decided to trust her. Iris called ahead, he said. Sit down. She sat. Iris Delaney was in the chair beside her, having driven Nora to town because she said the truck's heater sounded like it needed looking at, and she didn't want her getting stranded in November. He looked at Nora for a moment with the measuring expression of someone who has spent a career evaluating how much of a situation a client can absorb at one sitting. Then he said, What do you know about Gordon Pryce? I know he's been interested in the mineral rights to the south section of the property for years. I know Elias refused to deal with him. I know he came to the property 2 days after I arrived, which means he was watching for occupancy. Hale nodded. That's the surface. Let me tell you the underneath. He leaned back in his chair. Pryce came to this county 11 years ago. Before that, he was in Billings running a property management company. Before that, he was in Wyoming with a company that specialized in acquiring mineral rights from landowners who didn't know what they were worth. That company was the subject of a civil complaint in 2009. 8 plaintiffs, all of them small landowners who'd sold rights at significant undervaluation. The complaint was settled without admission of liability, and the settlement amount was sealed. How did you find that out? He almost smiled. I'm old and I've been here a long time, and I read court filings for recreation. He folded his hands. When Pryce showed up here, I made it my business to know his history, because Elias was a friend of mine, and because men who move into a county with a specific acquisition strategy are worth understanding. The mineral rights he's been accumulating in this valley represent approximately 60% of the gold-bearing formation. Your property's south section represents another 22%. Without it, extraction is viable but inefficient. With it, the formation can be accessed from the optimal point and the cost per ounce drops substantially. What does he have on the other properties he's bought the rights from? Hale looked at her with something that might have been approval. That's exactly the right question. What he has is leverage. He bought the mineral rights, but not the surface rights on most of those properties, which means the landowners above the mineral rights are legally obligated to permit reasonable access for extraction. What counts as reasonable access is a matter of interpretation, and Pryce has lawyers who interpret it favorably. But the formation runs deep enough that the access question is moot without the right entry point, which is on your land. So the rights he already owns are worth much less without hers. Correct? Iris said, which was the first thing she'd said since they sat down. He needs me to sell, Nora said. He can't extract efficiently without it. What he needs is for you to be someone he can pressure, Hale said. He looked at her. You're 21 years old, you've never owned property, and you've just inherited a situation that has several moving parts. From his perspective, you're someone who can be overwhelmed or misled or simply worn down by the complexity of it. She considered that. What would overwhelming me look like? Legal challenges to the estate transfer, most likely. He could claim the collection is improperly documented and challenge the title on grounds that it affects the overall estate valuation. He could claim prior knowledge of an agreement with Elias about the mineral rights, which would be false but would require documentation to disprove. He could simply make the situation expensive enough that you feel pressure to settle, which means selling him what he wants at a price he sets. Can he actually challenge the title? He can try. He won't succeed, because the documentation is complete and Martin Whitaker is thorough. But trying costs him almost nothing and costs you time and legal fees. Iris shifted in her chair. Tell her about the survey crew. Hale picked up a manila folder from his desk and opened it. 6 years ago, as you apparently know, Elias caught a survey crew on his south section. The crew was employed by a company called TerraCrest Resources, which is a subsidiary of a holding company that, if you follow the corporate structure back far enough, is majority owned by Gordon Pryce. The trespass charge went nowhere. The survey data from that day, however, was used to update the geological assessment of the formation. A copy of that assessment found its way into a presentation document that Pryce used to secure a line of credit from a private lender in Billings 18 months ago. She frowned. He used data from an illegal trespass to finance the rest of his acquisitions. That's what the timing suggests. Proving it is a different matter. The survey crew's employment records don't clearly connect to Pryce's holding company without 3 or 4 corporate layers of unwinding. She looked at the folder. I've been unwinding them for 2 years in my spare time, because this is a small county and I have opinions about how business should be conducted in it. She looked at him and felt the particular relief of understanding that some people in the world kept careful records for reasons that had nothing to do with self-interest and everything to do with the belief that things should be done properly. What would I need to do to make that material useful? She asked. At minimum, a formal complaint to the county sheriff about the original trespass, which can still be filed since the statute of limitations for civil action hasn't run. That opens the door to discovery, which means Pryce's corporate structure becomes part of the record. The survey data becomes evidence of the trespass and of subsequent use of illegally obtained information. He paused. The leverage that gives you is not primarily legal. It's the threat of legal. A man who has built a financing structure on potentially tainted survey data doesn't want that data in a public court filing. She was quiet for a moment. You've been waiting for someone to walk through that door and file that complaint. He looked at her evenly. I've been waiting for someone who had standing to file it and reason to understand why it mattered. He closed the folder. You have both. She filed the complaint the following Tuesday. With Hale beside her and a copy of the survey crew's work order, the corporate tracing document Hale had compiled, and a sworn statement about the timing of the survey data's appearance in the Billings financing presentation. The sheriff was a woman named Lorelei Dantry who had been in the job for 7 years and listened to the presentation with the practiced neutrality of someone who had heard a great many versions of disputes between landowners and outside interests and had learned to reserve judgment until the documentation was in front of her. She read through Hale's materials with steady attention and then looked up and said, "I'll be in touch." On her way out of the sheriff's office, Nora's phone rang. The number was the embossed card number for Gordon Pryce. She let it ring through to voicemail and listened to it in the parking lot while Hale unlocked his car. "Miss Callahan, this is Gordon Pryce. I hope you're settling in well. I wanted to reach out before things get complicated, because I believe there are ways we can work together that would be to your significant benefit. I understand you've been in contact with legal counsel, which is wise, and I don't want there to be any misunderstanding between us. I'd welcome the chance to have a conversation. I'm available at your convenience." She saved the voicemail and sent a copy to Martin Whitaker with a note that said, "He called. I didn't answer. Is there anything I shouldn't say to him?" Whitaker called back within the hour. "Don't take his calls without me present. And don't be hostile," which I mention not because I think you would be, but because hostility gives him a narrative to work with. You're calm, you're informed, and you're not in a hurry. That's the posture that gives you the most options. She understood the posture. It was not unlike the posture she'd developed over years of navigating systems that held something she needed, the careful neutrality of someone who understood that reacting was a form of ceding ground. She did not call Pryce back. The folder in the locked cabinet held 28 pages of documents in a plastic sleeve. She read them on the second Friday evening, sitting at Elias's kitchen table with the stove going and the outside temperature down to something that made the farmhouse walls expand and contract audibly as the night came on. The documents were a combination of deed records, correspondence, and something she had not expected, a hand-typed account, 41 paragraphs on 7 pages of paper that had yellowed at the edges, of the 2 years Elias had spent fighting the state for custody of Nora after her mother surrendered parental rights. She read it slowly. He had hired an attorney in Bozeman. He had appeared before 2 different judges. He had submitted documentation of his financial stability, his property, his health, and his character, the latter in the form of letters from Iris Delaney, from Roderick Hale, from 3 other neighbors whose names Nora didn't know. The judges had found against him on the grounds that a 70-year-old widower living alone on a remote rural property was not an appropriate placement for a 5-year-old child in the state's care. He had appealed. The appeal had been denied. The state's reasoning, as he had transcribed it in his account, used the word infrastructure twice, meaning the absence of schools nearby, the distance from medical facilities, the isolation. They were not wrong that the infrastructure wasn't there. They were wrong about what mattered most, which was whether there was someone who would not leave. She put the pages down and looked at the fire. There was a final page in the folder, separate from the others, on notepaper with Elias's handwriting that was more recent than the typed account. The same lean script she'd been reading all week, but with the slight irregularity of a man in his mid-70s. He had written, "The state decided I wasn't suitable." I think about that word sometimes. Suitable. As if there is a standard configuration for the people who will not let you go. She folded the notepaper carefully and put it back with the others and replaced them all in the plastic sleeve and put the sleeve in the locked cabinet, which she closed with the combination and then sat in the silence of the kitchen for a long time. Janet Ash's written appraisal arrived by courier on the following Wednesday. It was thorough, as advertised, running to 46 pages including photographs and the raw data from every XRF reading. Nora read all of it and then called Martin Whitaker, who had already received his copy. She had a question that had been forming for several days. The reserve bays. Elias marked 9 of them reserved. What does that mean legally? Whitaker was quiet for a moment. He included an addendum to his estate instructions that I hadn't shared with you yet because I wanted to wait until the appraisal was complete. He specified that 9 bays were to remain undesignated in his bequest. Not empty. Undesignated, meaning they become yours to fill as you see fit, rather than carrying any specific instruction. He paused. He wrote a note about it. I'll read it to you. She waited. I built 30 bays, Whitaker read, because 30 seemed sufficient for what I intended to pass on, and because I built 9 extra because I had to leave room for the possibility that she would want to build something herself. I don't want to give her a finished thing with no space in it for her own contribution. The collection should be a beginning, not an ending. She looked at the kitchen window and the mountains beyond it, visible in the clear morning, white and very still. He understood, she said. He apparently did. Pryce made his first formal move 12 days after Nora filed the trespass complaint. His attorney, a man named Callum Bresser whose office was in Billings and whose letterhead featured a firm name with 4 surnames, sent a letter to Martin Whitaker disputing the estate transfer on the basis that certain assets within it, specifically the collection in the underground storage space, constituted investment funds that had been improperly designated as personal property and should therefore be subject to a different tax treatment that would require the estate to be reopened and re-evaluated. Whitaker called her the same day the letter arrived. He sounded untroubled. "This is a nuisance filing," he said. "The legal basis is thin. Personal property is personal property regardless of how it's stored or what it consists of, and the documentation Elias maintained is unambiguous. What they're hoping is that reopening the estate slows the transfer and gives them time to file additional challenges. What do? We respond promptly and completely. I'll have a response drafted within 48 hours. He paused. "There's something else. I had a call from Lorelei. Dantry at the sheriff's office this morning. The investigation into the trespass complaint has turned up something useful. The survey company that employed the crew that Elias caught on his land. It appears that same company did survey work for 3 other properties in this valley before Pryce acquired their mineral rights. If the sheriff can establish a pattern, the original trespass becomes part of a larger picture. How long does that take? Months, possibly. But it changes the shape of what Pryce is facing. Right now he's treating this as a negotiation. If it becomes a pattern of conduct investigation, the calculus changes." She was at the pond when he called, standing at the north bank where Elias had kept his camp chair and where the inlet came in clear and cold from the north pasture. The ice had retreated from the shallows since she'd arrived, the November freeze thawing into an early December that ran warmer than expected. The opening she'd made with the chisel had widened on its own, the ice pulling back to the deeper water. There was something she'd been thinking about for days that she hadn't said to anyone, and she said it to Whitaker now because he seemed like the right person, the one who had known Elias longest and who would understand the weight of it. "He built something, and he preserved it, and he left it to me," she said. "I understand that. But the mineral rights are part of the land, and the land is part of the estate, and I want to understand what he would have thought about a mining operation on the south section." Whitaker took a moment to answer. "He told me once that the land produced what it needed to produce, and that underground wealth should stay underground until there was genuine need to bring it up." He paused again. "He also said that the difference between him and the people who wanted to buy the mineral rights was that he had other ways to achieve the same end." She looked at the pond. He'd converted what was underground into something he could keep and control and leave. In a manner of speaking, what's in the bays is the value of what's under the ground, expressed in a form that can be inherited without digging up the land. He paused one more time, longer than the others. He was not entirely rational about the land. He had feelings about it that went beyond economics. She understood that too. She called her manager at the diner 4 days before her week was up and said she needed another 2 weeks and offered to forfeit the pay for the additional time. Her manager said, "Nora, we've got the opening shift covered. Take the time you need." She wasn't sure what she'd expected, but the directness of it, the absence of any calculation about what she was worth to the schedule, landed in a way she noticed. She called Della. Della listened to the whole account, which took 40 minutes, sitting in what was apparently the common room at Hillside based on the television sound in the background. When Nora finished, there was a moment of quiet. "So what are you going to do?" Della asked. "I don't know yet. The diner's going to wait for you?" She said so. Della was quiet for another moment. "You going to stay up there?" "I don't know," Nora said again. And then, because it was true, "I feel like I'm supposed to be here for a while. I don't know what comes after." "That's more than most people have," Della said. She said it without any particular weight, matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. Most people don't even have the while. After she hung up, Nora went to the workshop and opened the trapdoor and went down. She'd been down 4 times since Janet's visit, each time for a specific purpose, checking a measurement or confirming a detail from the notebook. This time she went without a purpose. She stood in the center of the space with the flashlight and looked at the 21 bays and the 9 empty ones. The stone walls held the cold evenly, that consistent 55 degrees that meant preservation. That meant everything here would be here in 10 years, 2050. The way gold works. The way fieldstone walls work. The way things built without shortcuts work. She thought about the 9 reserved bays and what Elias had written about leaving her room to build something herself. She was 21 years old. She had $312 in a savings account in Bozeman and a truck she'd bought with $800 and a diner job, and the specific competence of someone who had managed with very little for a long time and had not been destroyed by it. She also had this. The relationship between those two facts was not yet legible to her. She didn't know what you did with something this large when what you'd been doing all your life was something very small. She suspected the answer was that you kept doing the small things and let the large thing be a foundation rather than a replacement, that you didn't try to become a different person because the person you already were had been worth building. Elias had built for 22 years and filled 21 bays and left 9 empty. He had kept cattle and maintained fences and gone to the pond in the evenings. He had eaten from cans in his kitchen and slept under a wool blanket and gone to the pond and thought about her. The small things were the thing. She went back up the steps and closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug and stood in the cold workshop for a moment, listening to the wind work at the metal roof. The call from Lorelei Dantry came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Nora had filed the complaint. "I want to update you on where we are," Dantry said. She sounded like a person who delivered news without editorializing, which Nora had come to recognize as a professional courtesy that people in positions of authority either had or didn't. Her voice was neutral, factual. "We've confirmed that the survey company employed by Pryce conducted work on 4 properties in this valley prior to the sale of mineral rights from each of them. The dates of the survey work precede the sales in all 4 cases by between 8 and 14 months. We've also found correspondence between Pryce's holding company and the survey company that references the valley formation by name and describes the survey work as due diligence for acquisition. That's not a coincidence. The timing and the language are significant. I've referred the file to the State Attorney General's office. This is beyond a simple trespass now." She paused. "I want to be direct with you. This process is going to be slow, and there will be moments when it feels like nothing is happening. That's how investigations work. It doesn't mean nothing is happening." "I understand slow processes," Nora said. Dantry seemed to take that in for a moment. "Pryce's attorney filed a cease and desist letter with my office last week, claiming the investigation is harassment. I want you to know that letter is in a file and will be treated as evidence of awareness, which is legally significant." She paused again. "Your grandfather filed a complaint about the original trespass 6 years ago. It didn't go anywhere at the time because he was one person in a county where Pryce had relationships. The situation is different now." "How is it different?" "The documentation is complete and corroborated. You have credible legal representation. The pattern across 4 properties changes the character of what we're looking at." She said this without particular emphasis, as if she were reading from a checklist, but underneath the flatness of it was something Nora recognized as carefully maintained anger. A man who had spent 6 years acquiring mineral rights through a methodology that involved surveying without permission and then purchasing before landowners understood the value of what they had. That was not a small thing to be careful about. She thanked Dantry and hung up and sat on the porch steps in the cold afternoon, looking at the cottonwood trees and their bare winter structure against a sky the color of old tin. Hale called an hour later. "I heard from Lorelei. He moves fast," she said. He paused, and she could almost hear him appreciating the irony, since it was a thing she'd said to Iris about Pryce weeks ago. "The AG referral changes things. He's not going to go away, but his room to maneuver narrows. What he'll probably do next is make a legitimate offer on the mineral rights, something high enough to seem serious. His theory will be that the legal pressure is something you'll want to make go away, and that money accomplishes that. What happens if I sell the mineral rights? Nothing illegal. You'd have the money and he'd have the rights, and the investigation into the survey methodology becomes less relevant because the injured party has settled." He paused. "Your grandfather was asked to sell those rights 4 times in 6 years, that I know of. He never responded to any of the approaches. She looked at the pond, visible from the porch through the bare willow branches. He had his reasons. He did, and they were good ones. But you're not him, and the decision is yours, not his. She sat with that for a moment. The decision is mine. That's what inherited means. She walked the south section that afternoon, the full 30 acres that held the gold-bearing formation according to the geological survey she'd obtained through the trespass complaint process. It was ordinary-looking land, brown winter grass, a frozen drainage channel, a stand of cottonwood at the southwestern corner where a seasonal creek came through. Nothing about it announced what was underneath, the deep quartz vein running north to south at 300 feet, the gold suspended in the rock the way things stay suspended in rock for geological time, indifferent to human categories of value. Elias had known it was there and had chosen to leave it. She thought about what that choice had cost him in the simple financial sense, what he might have done with the money from a mineral rights sale, whether it would have made the search for her easier, whether it might have changed the legal outcome of the custody fight. She couldn't know. What she knew was that he had made a decision about the kind of relationship he wanted to have with this land. And the decision was that the land would not be used up, that whatever was in it would stay, and that the value he built would come from what he could make above the surface. The collection in the bays below the workshop was not the same as mineral extraction. She understood that distinction clearly, had understood it since the day she'd made the connection between what Pryce wanted to do with the underground formation and what Elias had done with his cattle and equipment and timber. The difference was that Elias had converted convertible things, labor and effort and saleable assets, into gold. He had not converted the land itself. The land was intact. Everything he'd built was built from the surface up. The decision about the mineral rights was not the same decision as the decision about the collection. They were separate choices about separate things, and she was allowed to make them differently. She stood at the south fence line and looked back toward the farmhouse, which was barely visible from this distance, the metal roof catching the last flat light. The mountains to the north were clear and very large. She knew what she was going to do, and she had known it since she'd stood in the underground room and looked at the 9 empty bays. The knowing had arrived gradually, the way things arrive when they're true rather than decided, accumulating from the particulars until the total was visible. She was not going to sell the mineral rights. Not because Elias wouldn't have, though he wouldn't have, and not because Gordon Pryce was someone she wanted to disadvantage, though she did. She was not going to sell because the land was intact, and she wanted it to stay intact, because the relationship she wanted to have with this place was the same relationship Elias had had with it, which was the relationship of someone who builds from the surface up and leaves the underneath alone. The 9 empty bays were hers to fill. That would take years, probably, and it would require her to build something worth converting, which was a different kind of problem than the one she'd been solving for the last several years. A better problem. The kind of problem that required a future rather than merely surviving the present. She had a future. It was a strange fact after a long time of not having one, and she stood at the south fence and held it carefully, the way you hold something you're not used to holding. The mountains to the north caught the last light and went briefly, brilliantly pink. Then the color faded and they were just mountains in the early dark, white and enormous and entirely without interest in what any person decided at any fence line. That indifference was not unkind. It was simply the scale at which mountains operated, and it was, she thought, one of the things Elias had liked about them. She walked back toward the farmhouse through the cold and the dark, following the fence line, and then cutting across the lower pasture past the pond, which lay still and dark and faintly silver at its center where the stars were beginning to come up. The hole she'd made in the ice weeks ago had long since healed over, the cold sealing it back flat and continuous, as if it had never been opened. The farmhouse windows were lit. She'd left the lamp on in the kitchen, and the light came through the glass and lay in a small rectangle on the frozen ground below the sill, pale and steady. She went up the porch steps and in through the door and stood for a moment in the warmth of the kitchen, feeling the stove's heat and the familiar smell of the house, wood smoke and age, and the specific presence of a place that had held one life for a long time and was beginning, carefully, tentatively, to hold another. The key was on the kitchen table where she'd left it. She picked it up and held it, feeling the weight and the roughness of the iron, and then she put it in her jacket pocket, which was where it lived now, and went to put more wood on the fire. Tomorrow she would call Martin Whitaker about the AG referral. She would call Roderick Hale about the next steps in the complaint. She would call Iris Delaney, because Iris had offered herself as a resource, and the offer had been genuine, and Nora had learned over years of necessary pragmatism to take genuine offers seriously. She would also, at some point, go back to Bozeman and collect her things. There wasn't much. A box under the bed, some clothes, the savings account with the $312 in it. The truck, which she'd driven here, and which would drive her back. She would give notice at the diner, and she would do it with gratitude, because the diner had fed her and given her a schedule to live inside, and had treated her, by and large, with basic decency, which was not a small thing to have been given. And then she would come back here, to this kitchen and this table and the stove that required attention twice a day, and the mountains that didn't care what she decided, and the pond that lay quiet at the south end of the property, and kept whatever it had been given, and kept moving even when it looked still. She fed the stove and sat at the table and looked at the key in the lamplight, thinking about the 9 empty bays and the years it would take, and what she would build to fill them. She was 21 years old, and she owned a farm in Montana and a collection she didn't have a frame of reference for yet. And she had a grandfather she'd never met who had spent 22 years making something for her with the patience of someone who believed she was worth the wait. He had been right. She was here. She went to Bozeman on a Monday, which was the second week of December, driving the 212 miles in the early morning when the roads were empty and the sky came up in stages behind the mountains, going from black to gray to a pale amber that didn't quite become sunrise before the clouds moved in from the northwest and buried it. The heater in the truck worked adequately. The radio picked up a country station out of Great Falls for the first hour, and then nothing but static, and she drove the rest of the way in the particular silence of a long drive taken alone, which was a silence she had always found useful rather than difficult. She had told Della she was coming, and Della had her coffee ready when she arrived, which was the kind of thing Della did without making anything of it. The small acts of care performed so matter-of-factly that they didn't require acknowledgement. They sat at the kitchen table at Hillside Transitional House, which was a table Nora had sat at for 14 months, and Della listened to the Fuller account, the pieces Nora hadn't gotten to on the phone, the folder in the locked cabinet, Elias's typed account of the custody fight, the note about infrastructure and suitable, and what he had written about that word in his own hand years later. Della was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "He kept fighting until he couldn't, and then he kept building." "That's right." Della wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "There's a difference," she said, "between people who stop caring about you because they want to and people who stop being able to reach you because the system is in the way." She looked at the cup. "I spent a long time not knowing which kind of family I had." She didn't say anything more about it, which meant she was saying something specific, and Nora heard it that way. They sat together for another hour, and Nora finished her coffee and went upstairs and packed the box from under her bed and her clothes into 2 garbage bags and her sleeping bag into its sack. The room was small and had a window that faced the parking lot, and she had never managed to make it feel like anything other than what it was, a temporary space maintained by necessity. And she looked at it for a moment before she left it and felt no particular sadness, only the clean acknowledgement that she had lived here and it had served its purpose, and she was done with it. She gave notice at the diner at 11 o'clock. Her manager, whose name was Connie and who had hired her 2 years ago without asking many questions about her history, which Nora had always quietly appreciated, listened and nodded, and then said she hoped things worked out up north, and that Nora's section would be hard to cover because she was fast and didn't drop things, and the customers she'd had for 2 years were going to notice. It was not a small thing to be told you'd be missed. Nora said so, and Connie looked at her in the slightly startled way of people who are not used to being thanked for ordinary kindness. And then she said the coffee was on her, and poured it before Nora could argue. She ate a late breakfast at the counter and drove to the bank and withdrew the $312 in cash, because it seemed like the right way to close that account, with the money in hand rather than transferred into the larger account Martin Whitaker had set up in Helena for the estate's liquid assets. The $312 was hers in a specific and distinct way from everything else that was now hers, earned in breakfasts and early shifts and tips left under coffee cups, and she wanted it to remain distinct. She folded it and put it in her wallet and drove back to Hillside and loaded her things into the truck. Della came out to the parking lot when she heard the truck running. You'll call, Della said. I'll call. Della looked at the loaded truck bed and the sleeping bag visible through the back window with the particular expression of someone who has watched many people leave this parking lot over years and has learned to read departures accurately. You're not coming back? She said. Not to this. No, Nora said. Della nodded slowly. That's the right answer. She drove out of Bozeman under the same flat gray sky she'd arrived under and went north into the Basin country, and the miles opened out around her the way they had 2 weeks earlier when she'd made this drive for the first time, the towns thinning and the fence lines taking over and the mountains eventually arriving at the northwest horizon like a statement that had been waiting to be made. She drove through the afternoon, and when the sky began to compress in the way it did before the early December dark, she was 40 miles out from the property, and she felt the particular quality of attention that comes when you're approaching somewhere you've decided is yours. She was not practiced at this feeling. She had no reference for it from the previous 21 years. What she'd had instead was the opposite experience, the quality of attention that comes when you're approaching somewhere that isn't yours, the careful neutrality you maintained in other people's spaces and in institutional spaces, the particular discipline of not setting things down as if you own them or leaving marks on the walls or assuming any configuration would be permanent. 11 placements in 16 years, and in each of them the same practiced lightness of a person who understood on some cellular level that they could be moved again at any time. The opposite feeling was not something she had a word for yet. She was working on it. She turned off the state highway onto the county road, and then onto the gravel track with the rusted mailbox, and the cottonwood branches made their complicated patterns against the last of the light, and the farmhouse came into view with its straight chimney, and its intact windows, and its weathered lower boards, and she sat in the truck for a moment after she parked, in the same way she had the first time, not because she needed to prepare herself, but because the moment seemed worth holding. The stove was cold, and it took her 20 minutes to bring the kitchen up to a temperature that didn't require a coat, but she had gotten good at the stove in 2 weeks, and she did it without difficulty, and stood with her hands near the warmth while the wood caught, and the pipe began to tick. She had 4 garbage bags of clothes and a box of books, and her sleeping bag in her toolbox, and she moved through the farmhouse placing things with the deliberateness of someone who has decided this is not temporary, and therefore every placement is also a small decision about how to live. Her clothes went in the dresser in the upstairs bedroom. The books went on the bottom shelf next to Elias's agricultural texts and the 2 worn books about the foster system that she was not going to move, not ever, because they said something important about who he had been that she wanted to keep saying. Her sleeping bag she left rolled in the corner of the bedroom because the wool blanket was sufficient and the sleeping bag was for when she needed it elsewhere. She was making soup from a can when her phone rang, and it was a number she didn't recognize, a Helena area code. She answered it. Miss Callahan, this is Lisa Barden with the State Attorney General's office. I've been assigned to the Pryce matter following the referral from the Teton County Sheriff. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you about what you've documented and about your grandfather's original complaint. She turned down the burner under the soup. I'm available now if you have time. There was a brief pause, the sound of papers being moved. That would be fine, actually. She had a precise voice, not unfriendly, organized. Let me ask you some preliminary questions. She asked them and Nora answered them, and the call lasted 40 minutes, which was a length of time that told her something about Lisa Barden's interest in the case. Because people in government offices didn't spend 40 minutes on preliminary calls unless they were finding what they were looking for. When the call ended, Nora ate her soup and thought about the investigation and what it would mean and whether it would end in anything, whether the careful documentation that Hale had done for 2 years in his spare time and in his reading glasses in his 1954 brick building would become the basis for something that mattered. She didn't know. She understood that she might file a complaint and refer a case and assemble documentation and still end with nothing because the institutions that governed these things were the same institutions that had told Elias he was not suitable, that had filed her under known next of kin and processed her through 11 placements without once calling Teton County to ask if anyone there was looking. Institutions moved according to their own logic, and that logic was not the logic of the people inside the situations they were governing. And Nora had learned this young and had never been naive about it since. But she had also learned that sometimes the documentation mattered, that sometimes the person who kept the folder for 2 years in a blonde brick office in a small Montana town had accumulated enough to make a difference. that sometimes the fact of being prepared when the moment arrived was itself a form of power. She washed her bowl and put it back in the cabinet and went to the living room and looked at the 3 photographs on the wall. The summer landscape, Elias at his fence post, her own second-grade face against the blue background, the collared shirt she still had in a box that was now sitting upstairs in the corner of the bedroom. She was going to hang something on these walls, not over these photographs, which were staying where they were, but in the other spaces, the blank stretches of plaster that had been Elias's for decades and were now hers. She didn't know yet what, but she thought about it the way she thought about the 9 empty bays, as a set of decisions that didn't have to be made immediately and were interesting precisely because they were open. She went to bed early and woke before the sun and fed the stove and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the sky change over the mountains. On the 3rd day after her return, a truck she didn't recognize came up the track, a blue Ford, old enough to be someone's reliable workhorse rather than a statement of any kind. The man who got out was perhaps 40, with the build of someone who did physical work and wore it without self-consciousness, in a canvas coat and work boots that had actual mud on them rather than the decorative kind. He looked at the farmhouse and then at her when she came out on the porch, and he had a quality she recognized immediately, a lack of performance, the absence of the particular social effort that people make when they want something from you. He said, "I'm Cal Brenner. I work some of Iris Delaney's land part-time, and I did some fencing work for your grandfather over the last 5 years. I wanted to see if the property needed anything looked at before the hard weather comes." She looked at him. "Did Iris send you? She mentioned you were back." He paused. Elias had some projects in progress when his health went. The south fence on the creek section has a run that was going to need restringing in spring, and he had the materials in the barn already ordered and staged. I didn't want them to sit unused and make the job harder in April. She invited him in for coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, and he told her, without elaboration, what Elias had been planning. The fence materials. A drainage improvement on the northwest corner that would require renting a small excavator. A repair to the barn's north wall where a board had been replaced incorrectly some years back and was beginning to create a moisture problem. He described each item with the precision of someone who had looked at it carefully and understood what it needed, and she listened and took notes on the back of an envelope. He wasn't asking for work. She understood that quickly. He was delivering information because he had it, and because the information was useful, and because he had apparently decided that whoever Elias had been waiting for deserved to inherit the knowledge of the land along with the title to it. She asked how much Elias had paid him, and he told her, and she said she'd pay the same for the fence work when they got to it in the spring, and he nodded and finished his coffee and stood up. He was almost at the door when he stopped and turned back. "Elias talked about you," he said. "Not often. He was a private man. But sometimes when we were working he'd say something." He paused and seemed to decide whether to go on. "He said once that the most important things you do in your life aren't always the things that succeed. Sometimes they're the things you keep doing even when they don't." She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. "He said that about the search?" "He didn't say it about anything in particular," Brenner said. "He just said it. We were fixing a gate post, and he said it and went back to work." He looked at her for a moment with the direct, unperforming look she'd noticed when he got out of the truck. "I think he said it because he was thinking about something specific, but he kept the specifics to himself." He went out. She stood on the porch and watched his truck back down the track and listened to the cottonwood branches and felt the cold come off the northwest and thought about what it meant that Elias had spent years doing something that didn't succeed in the way he'd intended and had kept doing it anyway and had understood that the keeping was itself the point. He'd been right about that too. She went inside and put more wood on the stove. The letter from Pryce's attorney arrived 10 days before Christmas, forwarded through Martin Whitaker with a cover note that said simply, "As anticipated." The letter offered to purchase the mineral rights to the south section at a figure that was, Whitaker had written in the margin in pencil, approximately 40% of their actual assessed value as of the last geological survey, which he noted had been paid for with Pryce's own money and which Pryce apparently assumed she hadn't seen. She read it once and put it on the kitchen table and went about her day, which consisted of splitting wood in the morning and walking the fence line in the afternoon and reading in the evening in Elias's chair with its compressed cushion and its particular position in relation to the window that got the best light. She had found, in the second week of her residence, that she had opinions about which light was best in this house, which hours of the day the kitchen received it, and which hours belonged to the living room, and which to the upstairs bedroom, and she had begun organizing herself around these opinions in the way of someone learning the character of a place. She called Whitaker the following morning and said she would not be responding to the offer. He said, "I'll note that for the record." She said, "What's happening with the AG investigation?" "Moving," he said, slowly, "as Lorelei Dantry promised you it would. Lisa Barden is thorough. She has subpoenaed Pryce's corporate records, which Pryce's attorney is contesting, which is itself evidence of what the records contain." He paused. "There's something else. One of the landowners who sold mineral rights to Pryce 2 years ago, a man named Hendricks who runs cattle on the eastern side of the valley, has been in contact with Roderick Hale. He's had time to understand what his rights were worth, and he's considering whether he was dealt with honestly. If he wasn't, that's another complaint. Potentially. And a second complainant changes the character of the investigation significantly." She could hear him choose his words carefully. "Your grandfather filed his original complaint alone, as an old man, against a man with corporate resources and legal representation. You filed your complaint with documentation accumulated over years and with the support of this office. Hendricks, if he files, adds corroboration that this was a methodology, not an incident." She looked out the kitchen window at the mountains. "He built something," she said, and the something outlasted him. "That is, I think, what he intended." She spent Christmas morning walking the full perimeter of the property, which had become a kind of practice for her. The 2-hour walk that let her read the condition of the land and the progress of the winter and whatever small changes the recent weather had made to the drainage and the fence lines and the behavior of the creek. Cal Brenner had walked it with her once and pointed out things she hadn't known how to see. The way certain grasses indicated subsurface moisture, the places where frost heave had lifted fence posts by fractions of an inch over years and would eventually require resetting. She was accumulating the knowledge slowly, and she was patient about it. She called Della in the afternoon. Della was at her sister's house in Missoula, which Nora hadn't known she had, and there were children's voices in the background and the sound of a television. They talked for half an hour about nothing much, which was a form of conversation Nora had not had much practice with but was learning. She ate a meal she had made herself from real ingredients, because she had decided in her second week that she was going to learn to cook properly, not from any sense of occasion, but from the practical recognition that she was now living somewhere with a kitchen and a pantry and no good reason to eat from cans indefinitely. She had found 3 cookbooks in Elias's kitchen cabinets, well-used ones, their spines cracked at favorite pages, and she was working through them with the same methodical attention she'd given the record notebook and the journal, reading them as documents that told her something about how he'd lived. After the meal, she went to the living room and sat in the reading chair and looked at the 3 photographs for a while. And then she got up and opened the cardboard box she'd brought from Bozeman, the one that had been under her bed at Hillside, and went through it slowly. There was not much. Some papers. A photograph of her at the diner taken by a customer one afternoon who'd had a camera and had given her the print, which she'd kept because it was the only photograph she had of herself as an adult. Some letters from caseworkers over the years, the official ones that notified her of transitions and hearings and aging out timelines. A birthday card from a woman she'd worked with at a grocery store 3 years ago, signed with genuine warmth. The collared shirt. She took the shirt out and held it and looked at it. It was small, still sized for a 7-year-old, and it had been washed so many times the blue was faded to the color of old denim. She had kept it through 11 placements in 4 counties and had never been able to say precisely why, only that it was one of the things that was hers in the specific way that some things are yours regardless of where you live or how often you move. She looked at the photograph on the wall and at the shirt in her hands and understood now what had been true all along without her knowing it, that Elias had had a copy of the same photograph and had looked at it in this room for years, and that the shirt in the photograph was the one she was holding, and that both of them had kept their version of the same image without knowing the other had it. She folded the shirt carefully and put it back in the box and set the box on the shelf in the living room, which was where it was going to stay. January arrived with weather that Iris Delaney described as a normal Teton County January, which meant cold that had authority in it. Temperatures that dropped below 0 on a regular basis and went lower on the nights when the wind came straight from the north without obstruction. The farmhouse held the cold out adequately, which meant it was not warm by the standards she'd grown up with in buildings that had modern insulation, but it was a cold that responded to the stove, that could be managed with 2 good log additions and a properly adjusted damper, and she had learned the management of it with the attention she'd given everything else about this place. She drove into town twice a week for supplies, and she had by now exchanged enough words with enough people in the small geography of Callahan Flats to be recognized, which was different from being known, but was the preliminary to it. The woman at the feed store who had known Elias for 30 years and told Nora, on her 3rd visit, that he had mentioned her the previous spring, that he had said, "I expect someone will be coming to take over the property," which the woman had understood to mean a buyer or a hired manager, and which she now understood to mean something else entirely. The man at the gas station who had gone to school with Nora's mother decades ago, and who stopped her once to say this carefully and without expectation, as if he simply wanted her to know that Kathleen Callahan had been a real person in this place before she was a fact in a file. She listened to both of these people with the full attention they deserved and asked no questions she wasn't ready for the answers to, which was a discipline she'd learned young and was still useful. Roderick Hale called in late January to tell her that Gerald Hendricks had filed his complaint with the AG's office, citing the same survey methodology and the same undervaluation, and that 2 other landowners in the valley were in conversation with Hale's office about whether their own mineral rights sales warranted scrutiny. The case had become something larger than a single property dispute, which was what it had always been, but which the institutions now had to acknowledge because there were enough complaints to require it. Pryce sent another letter in February. This one came directly to the Farmhouse address rather than through Whitaker, which was a small escalation in style, if not in substance. The offer was higher than the first, closer to the actual assessed value, which meant his lawyers had told him that the 40% of value approach was not going to work on this particular recipient. The letter was pleasant in tone and careful in language, and she read it once, as she'd read the first one, and put it on the kitchen table and went about her day. She was splitting wood when Iris Delaney came by that afternoon, as she did 2 or 3 times a week now, sometimes with a purpose and sometimes without one. Iris watched her work for a moment, and then picked up the second axe without being asked, and they split wood together for an hour in the cold afternoon air, working in the comfortable rhythm of people who don't need to fill silence with conversation. When they came inside, Iris read the letter on the kitchen table and set it back down without comment. Then she said, "He's adjusting." "Toward what?" "Toward the possibility that you won't sell." She sat down and accepted the coffee Nora put in front of her. Men who operate the way Pryce operates don't have much experience with people who simply don't need what they're offering. His leverage has always been that people need money or need simplicity or need to not have a legal complication in their lives. She looked at Nora steadily. "You don't need the money. You have Martin Whitaker for the legal complication. And you've been here long enough that the simplicity argument doesn't hold. He'll keep trying. Probably. But trying costs him something. His financing is structured around controlling this formation, and as long as you hold this section, his whole assembly is less viable than he told his lenders it would be. The more time that passes, the more he has to answer for that." She thought about what Martin Whitaker had said weeks ago, that the legal challenge to the estate would cost Pryce almost nothing and cost her time and fees. The situation had inverted somewhat. Now it was Pryce who was paying for the passage of time, in the form of a financing structure that didn't perform as promised. She wasn't taking pleasure in that, exactly. She was noting it as a fact about how patience operated as a strategy, which was a thing Elias had understood as well as anyone she'd come to know, and which she was learning. The AG investigation produced its first formal finding in March. Lisa Barden called Nora directly, which was not something she'd done before, and her voice had in it a different quality than the procedural precision of their earlier calls, something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. The finding documented a pattern of trespass-predicated acquisition across 7 properties in Teton County. It named Pryce's holding company and the survey firm and documented the corporate relationship between them. It recommended referral to the county attorney for criminal consideration on the trespass counts and to the State Securities Division for investigation of whether the survey data had been improperly used in the financing representations to private lenders. "It does not mean charges will be filed," Barden said. "I want to be honest about that. The criminal referral will go through its own process. But the finding creates a public record that is difficult to ignore, and it makes any further attempts by Pryce to acquire mineral rights in this valley considerably more complicated, because any future transaction will be examined in the context of this document. That's something, Nora said. It's something, Barton agreed. She paused. Your grandfather's original complaint is cited in the finding. The trespass he reported 6 years ago is the foundational incident. She paused again, briefly. It took longer than it should have. She understood what Barton was saying and received it as it was meant. A lot of things took longer than they should have. After the call, she went to the workshop and opened the trapdoor and went down the stairs into the stone-smelling quiet below. She did this sometimes when she needed to think, not to look at the collection specifically, but to be in the space, to feel the consistency of its temperature and the solidity of its construction and the particular quality of a room that had been built for a purpose and had fulfilled it. She stood in the center and held the flashlight and looked at the 21 bays and the 9 empty ones and thought about what she was building. She had, in the months since arriving, begun the preliminary work of understanding the land's potential as a working property. Not at Elias's scale, he had run cattle, which required infrastructure and knowledge she was building slowly, but in smaller ways. She had spoken to Cal Brenner about what the land could sustain. She had spoken to a woman at the county extension office about hay production on the north pasture. She had looked into the timber management plan for the Ponderosa stand on the southeast corner, which had been put in by Elias's father and which, managed correctly, would produce income on a sustainable cycle without the land losing anything. These were small beginnings. She was not pretending they were otherwise. But she understood from the notebook in the workshop and from the journal upstairs and from everything she had come to know about Elias that small beginnings done carefully were the mechanism of large things done over time, and she had, for the first time in her adult life, time that was hers. She went back up the stairs and closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug, and she stood in the workshop and looked at the shelves with their archival materials and the scale and the testing acids and thought about what she would need to learn to use them. Not to appraise what was already there, but to understand the process, to have the knowledge that would let her make her own decisions about what the 9 empty bays would hold. She had enrolled in 2 online courses in the winter, one in land management and one in basic accounting, because Martin Whitaker had told her early on that the most important protection for what she had was her own understanding of it, that she should not depend entirely on the people she'd hired to understand things for her. She agreed. She had always agreed with that principle, had applied it in every situation she'd been in, had made it her business to know the rules of whatever system was currently governing her life well enough that the system could not use her ignorance against her. This was the same principle, applied to different material. She worked at it in the evenings, at the kitchen table with the stove going and the lamplight on the pages, in the same chair where Elias had sat reading the books about the foster system, in the same circle of light where he had looked at the photograph and thought, that's her. She worked and she learned and she asked questions of Whitaker and Hale and Iris and Cal Brenner, and she did not pretend to know things she didn't know, which was the discipline that made learning possible. Spring came to Teton County in the way that spring comes to high country places, not with warmth exactly, but with a different quality of cold, a cold that admitted the possibility of its own ending. The creek came up. The frozen north end of the pond thawed and the inlet ran clear again, bringing snowmelt from the north pasture. The cottonwoods showed the first pale green of bud along their upper branches, barely visible from the ground. She was at the pond on the first warm afternoon of April, which was warm relative to what the previous months had been, meaning 50 degrees and a full sun, and she had brought a camp chair from the barn and placed it at the north bank where the inlet came in, which was the spot Elias had described in the journal, where the water was clearest and you could watch the light change on the surface. She sat there and watched it. The water moved over the gravel of the inlet bed in the way that water moves over gravel, finding the lowest channel and filling it, and overflowing, and finding another, continuous and indifferent and restless in the way that looked like stillness from a distance. A pair of ducks came in low from the northwest and landed on the open southern end of the pond with the casual authority of birds returning to a place they'd used before. She had the key in her jacket pocket, as she always did. She took it out and held it in her palm and looked at it in the April light. The rust had not advanced since she'd lifted it from the ice. She had cleaned it once with oil and a cloth, not to make it look better, but to preserve what was there, which was what you did with things you intended to keep. She thought about what Elias had written. The pond is the place I've always gone to think about you. She thought about the 22 years of that, The evening walks down from the barn through the willow scrub, the camp chair on the north bank, the light changing on the surface, and in the mind of the man sitting in the chair, a girl he couldn't reach, growing up somewhere in the system without knowing he existed. She did not feel grief about this, or not primarily. What she felt was something more complex and less named, the awareness of a history that had existed without her knowledge, a parallel life that had been running alongside her own through all the years she'd spent believing she was alone in the particular way that children in the system learned to believe, not as self-pity, but as a realistic assessment of what the file said and what the file meant. The file had been wrong. Not maliciously. The file was wrong because files record what they can verify and cannot record what they can't find, and Elias had been unfindable to the file the same way she had been unfindable to him. They had existed in parallel, each real, neither documented in the other's record. She was documented now, not in any institutional file, not in any official record, but in the specific way that mattered, which was the photograph on the living room wall, and the journal on the nightstand, and the 30 bays in the room beneath the workshop, and the key in her hand. She was documented in the record of a man who had spent 22 years building something that said, in the only language available to him across that distance, "You were worth this." She put the key back in her pocket and sat with the ducks on the pond's southern end, and the inlet moving over the gravel beside her, and the mountains to the north still holding their winter white even as the valley grass was beginning, very slowly, to show the first pale green of the season coming. Cal Brenner came by the following week, and they started on the south fence, the run that Elias had staged materials for, and they worked through 3 days of good weather, setting new posts where the old ones had rotted past utility and restringing wire and stapling it correctly, in the way that Brenner had explained to her, and she had watched and then done herself under his observation until she was doing it right. The work was physical and specific and had the quality she had come to associate with the right kind of labor, the kind where your hands know what they're doing and your mind is free to move around in the background. He told her, working one afternoon on a corner post, that Elias had taught him to fence when he was 14. His family had leased a pasture from the Callahan property for grazing, and Elias had offered to teach him the work in exchange for help with the seasonal fencing. He said this without sentiment, in the way he said most things, but it landed as the thing it was, a form of continuity, the knowledge of the land passing through Elias from wherever he'd gotten it, and through Brenner to her. She was being taught by someone who had been taught by Elias. The chain of it was not lost on her. When the fence was done, they walked its length and checked each post and each run of wire, and there was nothing to correct, which was the goal. Brenner said it would hold for 15 years if the staples were driven properly, and she had driven them properly, and she looked at the finished fence line in the April afternoon light and felt the particular satisfaction of something done right. Pryce's attorney sent a final letter in May. It was not an offer this time. It was a notification, in careful legal language, that Pryce Land Management and Development was withdrawing its interest in the Callahan Flats parcel and that there were no current or prospective claims against the mineral rights to that property. Martin Whitaker read it to her over the phone with a tone she had come to recognize as his version of satisfaction, measured and professional, but present underneath. "I won't pretend this is fully resolved," he said. "The AG investigation is ongoing, and there may be further developments. But as far as Pryce's direct interest in this property goes, the letter is as close to a withdrawal as we could have hoped for." She sat at the kitchen table with the phone. What changed his mind? A combination of things, I think. The AG finding made further acquisition attempts in this valley untenable. The Hendricks complaint and the 2 others created a pattern he can't argue away. And the private lender who financed his mineral rights acquisition has apparently been asking questions about the survey data that underlies the original assessment. When your financing depends on a document whose provenance is under investigation, your options narrow. She thought about the timing. He'd bought the other properties and built his financing structure over 5 years, and in the time between her arriving at this farm and the letter she was now holding, the whole structure had become something he needed to distance himself from. He built it on a premise that the surface landowner could be persuaded or pressured, she said, or that the landowner wouldn't be there long enough to matter. He'd been waiting for either the property to come to market or for an heir who could be managed. He paused. He misjudged what he was getting. She looked at the photograph on the living room wall through the kitchen doorway. The blue background. The collared shirt. Second grade. He misjudged what Elias left. That is exactly right, Whitaker said. She planted a kitchen garden in May along the south wall of the farmhouse, where the soil was warmest and the structure blocked the northwest wind. It was a small thing, 6 raised beds made from the lumber she found stacked in the barn, and she filled them with the topsoil from the garden Elias had kept in the same location, which she found when she pulled back the winter-dead debris and discovered it had been well amended and ready to receive seeds. He had gardened here. Of course he had. She planted what seemed right for the elevation and the season, and she did it with the attention she'd given the fence work, the right depth and the right spacing, which she'd read about in one of the books in the kitchen cabinets, a seed-saving guide published in 1987 whose pages were soft from use. Iris Delaney came by the afternoon she finished planting and looked at the beds and said they were positioned correctly and that Elias had grown tomatoes along that wall every year until his mobility had made bending down difficult. Nora looked at the beds. I'll grow tomatoes along that wall every year. Iris looked at her with the direct expression she'd worn from the first day Nora had met her. She said, without any excessive sentiment, he would have liked you very much. She said it as a conclusion reached from evidence, which was how Iris said everything, and which was, Nora thought, the highest form of something, the decision to trust evidence over wish. She came down to the underground room on a warm evening in June, which was the longest day of the year approximately, the solstice, and she brought a notebook and a pen and a fresh flashlight, and she sat on the overturned bucket and spent 2 hours reading through the record notebook for the 5th or 6th time, but differently now. Reading it the way you read something you understand rather than the way you read something you're trying to decode. She read the entries in order, following the accumulation, watching the bays fill across 12 years of deliberate addition, the pattern of conversion that Elias had maintained through good years and poor ones, through the seasons of this land, and the fluctuations of the gold market and the long, slow attrition of trying to find her through institutions that were not designed to be found through. He had kept building regardless. She opened her own notebook and made a first entry. The date, which was the solstice. The weather, which was clear and warm, the best the valley had been since she'd arrived. The condition of the 9 empty bays, which she had inspected with a flashlight and found clean and dry and ready. And then, in her own handwriting, a figure that represented the first small conversion she intended to make, drawn from the salary she'd saved since arriving, not from the estate assets, but from the work she'd done on the property and the money she'd earned through it, which had begun to accrue in the account Whitaker had set up when she'd sold a portion of the timber rights on the southeast corner stand, the portion that was ready for harvest without disrupting the windbreak's function. Small, she wrote, but a beginning. She looked at the 9 empty bays in the flashlight beam and thought about how long it would take, and the thought was not discouraging. She had a framework for long work now. She had lived inside the evidence of it for 8 months, had slept above it and eaten beside it and walked the land it grew from. And she understood in the specific way of someone who has inhabited an idea rather than merely thought it that long work was not long because it was slow, but because it was patient, and patience was not the absence of urgency, but the presence of a perspective that made urgency unnecessary. Elias had gone to the pond in the evenings and thought about her, and then gone back to the house and written in his journal, and then the next morning gone out to the land and done the work of it, and done this for 22 years. Not dramatically. Not with the quality of sacrifice that makes a story, just with the daily discipline of a man who had decided what mattered and organized his life around it accordingly. She climbed out of the room and closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug and walked through the workshop and out into the evening. The longest day of the year was still giving light at 9 o'clock, the sky a deep and complicated blue above the mountains, holding the last of the sun below the horizon in a glow that seemed to take its time about fading. The cottonwoods along the track were in full leaf. The garden along the south wall of the farmhouse was 2 months in, and the tomato plants had set fruit, and the other beds were producing. The south fence ran clean and true from the corner post she'd reset with Brenner to the property line at the creek, which was running well this year from a good snowpack melt. She walked to the pond. The camp chair was at the north bank where she'd left it after the last time, and she sat in it in the long June evening light and watched the inlet come in over the gravel and the water surface catch the last blue of the sky. The ducks that had returned in April were still on the pond, a pair, and they moved in the unhurried manner of animals that had decided this was their water for the season. She had the key in her jacket pocket. She always had the key. She took it out and held it in the evening light and looked at the stamped metal tag with her name on it, the 4 letters pressed in by hand, each one slightly different in depth from the one beside it. The work of someone who had been careful but not perfect, which was the right combination for something that was meant to last. She turned the key over in her fingers and felt the weight of it and the roughness and the solidity of the iron underneath the rust, unchanged from the day it had been made, unchanged from the day it had been placed near this water, unchanged from the day she had pulled it from the ice with numb fingers in the November cold, 8 months ago, a lifetime ago, before she had known what this place was or what it would become or what it meant to be known by someone you'd never met. She was known now in a different way, not by a grandfather who was watching from a distance and building toward her across a gap he couldn't close, by the land itself, which had her footprints on its fence lines and her seeds in its soil and her mornings in its kitchen and her evenings at its pond. She was becoming known to this place the same way a person becomes known to any place, through accumulated presence, through the patient work of being there repeatedly until the place holds the shape of you. The light went slowly, the way it does at the solstice, reluctant, the sky moving through shades of blue that didn't want to become dark. The mountains to the north were visible until the last of it, their white peaks catching what remained and giving it back in that particular color that she had come to understand as one of the specific gifts of this geography, the pink light of high snow at the end of a clear day. Then the mountains went to gray and the stars came. She sat at the north bank of the pond that Elias had sat at for 20 years and watched the stars come up in the sequence she was beginning to learn, the same sequence he had watched in this same chair in this same place. And she held the key in her hand with the pond moving beside her and the house lit behind her and the underground room below the workshop full of what he had built for her. And she felt the particular quality of a place that has been thought about with love for a long time, how it becomes suffused with that thinking, how it holds the trace of it in the way that old wood holds warmth, long after the original fire is gone. She was not alone. She had not been alone, it turned out, for a long time, though she hadn't known it. She had been carried in someone's mind through the years the same way the key had been carried in the ice, held and preserved and waiting for the moment when she'd be ready to receive it. She was ready. She put the key in her pocket and sat for a while longer in the dark, listening to the inlet move over the gravel and the night birds begin their business in the willows. And when she finally got up and folded the camp chair and walked back through the warm June dark to the farmhouse, she did it with the unhurried step of someone who knows that the place they are walking toward will be there when they arrive. The light in the kitchen window was on. She had left it on. She went up the porch steps and in through the door and stood in the kitchen warmth and looked at the table and the lamp and the bowl she'd left from dinner and the journal that was open to the page she'd been reading the previous evening. And she understood, standing in that doorway, that she had become, without announcement or fanfare or any single moment she could point to, the person who lived here. Not a visitor. Not someone processing a change in circumstances. Not someone with a month-to-month lease and a truck she was maintaining with the anxious attention of someone who cannot afford for it to fail. The person who lived here. She had a kitchen garden and a south fence she'd strung herself and a camp chair at the north bank of the pond, and a record notebook in the underground room with one entry in her own handwriting and 8 months of mornings at this window watching the mountains change. She had, for the first time in her life, a place that was hers in the way that places are yours when you've stayed long enough and worked hard enough and cared enough about the specific character of a thing to learn it rather than endure it. Elias had built 30 bays. She had 9 to fill. She had, as nearly as she could calculate, the rest of her life in which to fill them, and the land above to build from, and the work of it ahead of her, patient and specific and entirely, completely hers. She closed the door and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the dark mountains and the stars above them. And then she turned to the table and sat down and opened the notebook and wrote the date, which was the solstice, and the weather, which was clear. She wrote, second entry. She sat in the lamplight and thought about what came next, and what came next was a long and interesting problem, the kind that took years and required attention and would change shape as she changed and would give back, in the way of good work, more than it asked for. She picked up the pen and began. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.